Imagine standing at the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza at night. Not the tourist experience, not the sound and light show, not the crowds, not the modern city of Cairo glowing on the horizon. Just the pyramid itself, in the dark, with the stars overhead, and the desert around you and the stone in front of you. The stone is closer than you expected. You are standing perhaps 2 meters from the base, and the pyramid fills your entire field of vision. It is not a shape in the distance, not a silhouette against the sky that you can take in whole. It is a wall, an enormous, almost vertical wall of limestone that extends left and right beyond your peripheral vision and rises above you at an angle that your body interprets as threatening. The instinctive response to a very large thing leaning over you, even though the pyramid is not leaning, is not about to fall, is as stable as any structure on Earth. The individual blocks are larger than you expected too. Each one is, at the base of the pyramid, the height of a man, and wider than a man's arm span. They are not neatly uniform. They vary in size, in shape, in the precise way they fit against their neighbors. But they are massive. Each block is massive. And there are, in the structure behind the surface you are looking at, approximately 2.5 million of them. 2.5 million blocks, stacked in 203 courses, rising to an original height of 146.5 meters. Now, with the casing stones stripped away over centuries and the capstone long gone, standing at approximately 138 meters, covering a base of nearly 53,000 square meters. Oriented to the cardinal directions with an accuracy that, even today, with GPS and laser measuring equipment, leaves engineers impressed. You stand at the base of this thing in the dark, and you try to hold it in your mind, and you cannot. The scale defeats imagination, not because imagination is insufficient. Human imagination is extraordinary, capable of conceiving things vastly larger than any monument. But because the pyramid is here, physically, and the scale of its physical presence is not something the mind can process the way it processes an abstract number. 2.5 million blocks is a fact you can hold. Standing at the base in the dark is an experience you cannot. The stone under your hand, if you reach out and touch it, if the guards allow it, if you can reach past the low fence at the base, is warm. The Egyptian sun has been heating the limestone since dawn, and the stone holds that heat long into the night. It is warm in the way that very large thermal masses are warm, not the warmth of a living thing, but the warmth of something that absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly, that maintains a temperature far more stable than anything biological. The pyramid is warm in the dark, and it has been here for how long? That is the question we are going to sit with tonight. My name is Arthur, and tonight we are going to stand at the base of the most famous structure in the world and ask a question that seems simple and turns out not to be. How old is it? The conventional answer, which you will find in every textbook and every museum label and every documentary narrated in a confident baritone, is approximately 4,500 years. The Great Pyramid, the conventional answer says, was built during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu, also known as Cheops, of the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom of Ancient Egypt, which Egyptologists date to approximately 2560 BCE, give or take a few decades. This is a well-supported date, arrived at through careful scholarship, cross-referenced against astronomical records and king lists, and the accounts of later ancient historians. It is not a guess. It is the product of more than 2 centuries of serious Egyptological research by scholars who devoted their careers to understanding the chronology of ancient Egypt. But it is also in a way that becomes clear when you start to look carefully at the specific evidence for the pyramid's age, rather than the general framework of Egyptian chronology, less certain than it sounds. And tonight, we are going to look carefully. Before we go any further into the stone and the stars and the long argument about what the pyramid really is, I want to say hello to whoever is listening right now. I don't know what time it is where you are. I don't know whether you're lying in bed with the lights off and this playing quietly, or sitting somewhere with a cup of something warm, or driving on a long night road with the dark moving past the windows. I don't know whether you've been following this series from the beginning, in which case you already know the Sumerians and the comet and the carved pillars of Göbekli Tepe, and the Great Pyramid is the next point in a journey we've been on together for a while. Or whether this is the first time you've joined me. If it's the first time, welcome. Arthur's Sleepy History is a place for the questions that don't resolve easily, for the things that archaeologists argue about in academic journals, and alternative researchers argue about on podcasts, and everyone who lies awake at night wondering about the deep past argues about in their own heads. We go slowly here. We hold the uncertainty carefully. We try to be honest about what we know and what we don't. If you've been here before, hello again. Tonight, we're going to the most visited archaeological site in the world and asking whether we have fundamentally misunderstood it. If you feel like leaving a comment, tell me where you are and what time it is. Those comments mean a great deal to me. All of us, in different places, in the dark, thinking about the same ancient stone. And if you want to be here every time I find something worth wondering about, the subscribe button is there. All right, let's talk about what we know. The pharaoh Khufu, whose Horus name was Megidu, whose full titulary is elaborate and impressive in the way that all pharaonic titularies are, ruled Egypt for somewhere between 23 and 63 years, depending on which sources you trust and how you interpret the fragmentary chronological evidence. The conventional estimate is around 26 to 27 years, with his reign beginning approximately in 2589 BCE. During his reign, according to the Egyptological consensus, the Great Pyramid was designed and built, a project that involved the quarrying of approximately 2.5 million limestone blocks from nearby quarries at Tura and Aswan, their transport to the Giza plateau, and their assembly into the most precisely engineered large structure the ancient world produced. The evidence connecting the Great Pyramid to Khufu is real, and it deserves to be stated clearly before we start asking difficult questions about it. In 1837, the British explorer Howard Vyse, excavating within the pyramid, discovered a series of chambers above the King's Chamber, spaces not accessible from below, built during construction and sealed when the courses above them were laid. These chambers, which appear to have served primarily as stress-relieving structures distributing the weight of the pyramid above the King's Chamber, contain painted inscriptions, graffiti left by the work gangs who built them. The inscriptions include names of the work gangs, and one of them contains a name that Egyptologists identified as a variation of Khufu's cartouche, the oval hieroglyphic seal that contains a pharaoh's name. This is the primary direct evidence connecting the Great Pyramid to Khufu, the name of his reign painted on the walls of a construction space that was sealed during building and not reopened until 1837. This evidence is real and significant. It is not fabricated. There have been suggestions over the years that Vyse may have inscribed the name himself, but the consensus of Egyptological scholarship is that this accusation is unfounded and that the inscriptions are genuine, ancient graffiti. But here is what the inscriptions do not tell us. They do not tell us when the pyramid was built. They tell us that workers in the construction of the pyramid identified themselves, or their work gang, with a name connected to Khufu's reign. This is consistent with the pyramid being built during Khufu's reign. but it is also consistent with the pyramid having been built earlier and renovated or completed during Khufu's reign, or with Khufu having added the upper chambers to an existing structure that predated his reign. These alternative interpretations are not mainstream. I am not advocating for them, but they illustrate the gap between the evidence and the conclusion, the space between what the inscriptions actually say and what the conventional narrative says they prove. The stronger argument for the conventional dating is not the graffiti, but the contextual argument. The Fourth Dynasty of Egypt is, by any measure, the most extraordinary period of pyramid building in human history. The pyramids at Dahshur, the Bent Pyramid and the Red Pyramid, built during the reign of Khufu's father Sneferu, show a clear technological development toward the Giza style. The Giza pyramids themselves show a development from the Great Pyramid through Khafra's pyramid to Menkaura's. And after the Fourth Dynasty, pyramid building becomes progressively less technically accomplished. The Pyramid of Unas, built a century after Khufu, is much smaller and much less precisely constructed. This developmental sequence, the learning curve of Egyptian pyramid technology, culminating at Giza and declining afterward, is the strongest evidence that the Great Pyramid was built in the period assigned to it. A structure of this sophistication could only have appeared at the peak of a developmental tradition, and that peak is the Fourth Dynasty. This is a compelling argument. I take it seriously. But it has a hidden assumption that is worth examining. The assumption is that the Great Pyramid is a product of the same tradition as the other pyramids, that it is the culmination of a single developmental sequence that began with the Step Pyramid of Djoser and ended with the declining constructions of the later Old Kingdom. What if it isn't? What if the Great Pyramid is different in kind from the other pyramids, not just in degree? What if the developmental sequence explains the other pyramids, but not this one? That is the question that some researchers, starting from the engineering anomalies in the pyramid itself and working outward, have been asking for several decades. And it leads somewhere genuinely interesting. Let me start with the basic dimensions because they are the foundation of everything that follows. The Great Pyramid, at its original height of 146.5 meters, and with a base perimeter of 921 meters, encodes a relationship to the Earth that is, when you notice it, very difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The ratio of the pyramid's height to its perimeter is almost exactly the same as the ratio of the Earth's radius to its circumference. That is, if you take the height of the pyramid and multiply it by 2 pi, the mathematical constant that relates a circle's diameter to its circumference, you get a number that is almost exactly equal to the pyramid's base perimeter. Height times 2 pi equals perimeter. This is the relationship between a sphere's diameter and its circumference. The pyramid encodes pi. This was noticed by various researchers in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and it has been dismissed by some as coincidence. The argument being that, if you look hard enough at a structure with thousands of dimensions and relationships, you will find approximations of any significant mathematical constant. This is a legitimate methodological concern, but the encoding of pi is not the only relationship. The pyramid also encodes phi, the golden ratio, approximately 1.618, the ratio that appears repeatedly in the geometry of natural growth, and that has been used consciously in art and architecture since at least the ancient Greeks. The ratio of the pyramid's slant height to half its base is approximately phi. Again, the precision is not perfect, but it is close enough that the question of whether it is intentional cannot be simply dismissed. And then there are the measurements in relation to the Earth itself. The Great Pyramid is located at approximately 29.9 degrees north latitude. The speed of light in a vacuum is approximately 299,792 kilometers per second, a number that, when expressed in the appropriate units, produces the number 29.979. The correspondence between the pyramid's latitude and the speed of light has been noted, though this is almost certainly coincidence. The modern definition of a meter, from which the speed of light figure is derived, postdates the pyramid by 4,500 years. More interesting and less easily dismissed as coincidence is the relationship between the pyramid and the Earth's polar radius. If you take the height of the pyramid and multiply it by 43,200, a number that is, as we have discussed in relation to the Sumerian king list, a multiple of the precessional cycle, you get a number that is approximately equal to the polar radius of the Earth. 43,200 is not a random number. It is 6 times 60 times 120. It is related to the base 60 mathematics we have already encountered in the Sumerian tradition, and the fact that multiplying it by the pyramid's height gives the Earth's polar radius with reasonable accuracy is the kind of correspondence that makes researchers stop and ask questions. The Egyptologist's response to these correspondences is typically one of two things. Either they are coincidence, the product of the human tendency to find patterns in numerical relationships, or they reflect the Egyptians' practical knowledge of the Earth's dimensions, acquired through their astronomical observations and their surveying tradition, without implying any deeper mystery. The alternative researcher's response is different. These correspondences, combined with the precision of the pyramid's alignment and the sophistication of its engineering, suggest a level of mathematical and astronomical knowledge that does not fit comfortably into the conventional picture of Old Kingdom Egypt. And that tension between what the pyramid contains and what the conventional account of its builders says they should have known, is where the most interesting questions live. Let me stay with the precision of the pyramid's alignment, because it is extraordinary by any standard. The base of the Great Pyramid is aligned to the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, with an accuracy of approximately 3.6 arc minutes of deviation from true north. To put this in context, 1 degree contains 60 arc minutes. 3.5 arc minutes is 1/17th of a degree. The error is, in practical terms, almost nothing. The builders of the pyramid achieved this alignment without GPS, without a magnetic compass, which had not been invented and would not have been useful in any case, since magnetic north and true north are not the same, and without any of the optical surveying instruments that modern engineers take for granted. How did they do it? The most plausible explanation is astronomical. True north can be determined by careful observation of the stars, specifically by observing the point in the sky around which all the other stars appear to rotate, which is the celestial North Pole. In the modern sky, the celestial North Pole is close to Polaris, the North Star. But as we have discussed in relation to precession, the position of the celestial North Pole changes over time, tracing a slow circle through the sky over approximately 26,000 years. At the time the Great Pyramid is conventionally dated, around 2560 BCE, the celestial North Pole was not near Polaris. It was in a part of the sky between the stars Thuban in the constellation Draco and Kochab in Ursa Minor. Neither of these stars was as conveniently close to the pole as Polaris is today, but with careful observation of the circumpolar stars, the stars that never set below the horizon at a given latitude, it was possible to determine the pole's position with high precision. Egyptian priests and astronomers were making exactly these kinds of careful observations. The alignment of the pyramid to true north almost certainly reflects the use of astronomical observation. the watching of the stars across many nights, the identification of the point around which they rotate, and the precise surveying of the pyramid's orientation against that point. This is sophisticated astronomy. It is not beyond what the ancient Egyptians were capable of. They were extraordinary astronomers, and their astronomical knowledge is well documented from texts and alignments across many sites. But it is a sophistication that is worth acknowledging rather than taking for granted. And the alignment to true north is not the only astronomical precision in the pyramid's construction. The entrance to the pyramid, the original entrance on the north face, which leads to the descending passage, is oriented at an angle that points to the circumpolar sky. At the time of the pyramid's construction, an observer standing at the bottom of the descending passage and looking up could have seen the pole star of that era, Thuban in the constellation Draco, moving across the field of view as it circled the pole. Robert Bauval, a Belgian-born author and researcher who has spent decades studying the astronomical alignments of the Giza monuments, has argued that the descending passage's alignment corresponds not to 2560 BCE, but to a different date. That when you calculate the date at which the passage would have been perfectly aligned with the pole star of the era, accounting for precession, the answer you get is not the 4th dynasty. It is much earlier. The specific date Bauval's calculations produce and the question of what that date implies is something we will sit with in detail in a later part of tonight's journey. For now, I want to stay in the present tense of the pyramid, at its base in the dark, with a warm stone under your hand. This thing was built by human beings. That is not in question. The evidence of the construction, the quarry marks, the tool traces, the workers' graffiti, the construction ramps and infrastructure that archaeologists have been finding in the surrounding area, makes clear that the pyramid was assembled by human hands, with human tools, through the organized effort of a large human workforce. What is in question is which human beings, when they lived, what they knew, and whether the conventional story of Khufu and the 4th dynasty is the complete story, or whether it is the last chapter of a much longer story that we have not yet fully recovered. That question, how old is the Great Pyramid really, and what does the answer imply, is one of the most consequential open questions in the archaeology of human civilization, and it deserves more than a dismissal. It deserves exactly what we are going to give it tonight. A long, slow, careful look. Let me tell you about what happens inside the pyramid, because the interior is where the strangest questions live. There are 3 main chambers inside the Great Pyramid, connected by passages of varying angle and dimension. The lowest chamber, the subterranean chamber, is cut directly into the bedrock beneath the pyramid. It is unfinished by any measure. The floor is rough, the walls are irregular, the ceiling is low and irregular. It looks like a chamber that was abandoned mid-construction, its purpose either changed or forgotten before it was completed. Above and inside the body of the pyramid itself, 2 further chambers are connected by the ascending passage, and the extraordinary Grand Gallery. The Grand Gallery is one of the most remarkable spaces in the ancient world. It is a corbelled hall, a passage where the walls step inward as they rise, each course of stone projecting slightly beyond the one below it, until the walls meet at the top in a narrow ceiling. The gallery is 8.5 meters tall, roughly 1 meter wide at the base, and 47 meters long. It rises at an angle of approximately 26 degrees toward the southeast. Walking up the Grand Gallery, or rather, imagining walking up it, since tourist access is now restricted, is a disorienting experience by all accounts. The steep angle, the height of the corbelled ceiling, the length of the passage, the strange recessed channels in the walls whose purpose is still debated. It is a space that feels designed to produce a specific effect, not merely to connect two chambers, but to do something to the person traversing it, to create an experience. What experience? That depends on what the pyramid was for, and what the pyramid was for is one of the central mysteries. At the top of the Grand Gallery is the King's Chamber. It is a rectangular room of red granite, not limestone as most of the pyramid's structure is, but the hard, precisely finished pink Aswan granite that had to be quarried from a site 800 kilometers to the south and transported to Giza by water and land. The walls, floor, and ceiling of the King's Chamber are lined with this granite, fitted together with a precision that modern stonemasons find astonishing. The King's Chamber is empty. It contains one object, a large, lidless, uninscribed granite box, the so-called sarcophagus, that sits at the western end of the room. The box is too large to have been brought in through the entrance passage. It must have been placed in the chamber during construction and the pyramid built around it. There is no mummy in the box. There has never been a mummy in the box, as far as we can tell. There are no wall inscriptions, no paintings, none of the elaborate decorative program that characterizes the burial chambers of later Egyptian royalty. The walls of the King's Chamber are bare granite. And this is where the conventional story starts to develop complications. The conventional account of the Great Pyramid is that it was built as a tomb for Khufu, the most elaborate tomb ever constructed, designed to ensure the pharaoh's safe passage to the afterlife and the preservation of his body through eternity. This is the function ascribed to the other Old Kingdom pyramids, and it is a reasonable inference from the general pattern of Egyptian funerary architecture. But if the Great Pyramid is a tomb, it is by some distance the worst designed tomb in the history of ancient Egypt. The pyramid contains no wall inscriptions, no paintings, no religious texts. None of the pyramid texts that appear in almost every other Old Kingdom royal burial. The so-called sarcophagus has no lid. There is no mechanism by which it could ever have been sealed. The chambers show no sign of ever having contained a body. No funerary goods, no canopic jars, no offering tables. The later pyramids, built within a generation or two of Khufu's by his successors, have all of these things. They have pyramid texts, they have decorated chambers, they have sarcophagi designed to be sealed. The Pyramid of Unas, built about 100 years after Khufu, has some of the most elaborate wall inscriptions of the Old Kingdom. Why would the builder of the largest and most sophisticated pyramid of all have omitted everything that defined the function of an Egyptian royal tomb? The mainstream Egyptological response is that the tradition of inscribing pyramid chambers with religious texts developed after Khufu's time. That the pyramid texts are a later innovation, and the absence of inscriptions in Khufu's pyramid reflects the practices of his era rather than an anomaly. This is a plausible response, and it may well be correct, but it leaves open the question of what the pyramid actually was. If not a conventional tomb, what was the King's Chamber for? What was the Grand Gallery for? What was the function of the elaborate system of shafts that penetrate the pyramid's body and point toward specific stars? The answers proposed by alternative researchers vary wildly, from energy machines to initiation chambers to astronomical instruments to repositories for knowledge. None of these alternatives has achieved scholarly acceptance, and some of them are frankly implausible. But the question they are responding to is legitimate. The Great Pyramid is not well explained as a conventional tomb, and if it is not a conventional tomb, what it actually is remains genuinely open. Let me spend some time with the workforce that built it, because the question of who built the pyramid is one of the areas where the conventional story has been most significantly revised in recent decades. For a long time, driven partly by the Greek historian Herodotus's account, partly by the scale of the monument and an understandable tendency to reach for the most dramatic explanation available. The Great Pyramid was associated in popular imagination with slave labor. 100,000 slaves, Herodotus claimed, working in shifts over 20 years. This image has been largely abandoned by modern Egyptology. The discovery in the 1990s of a workers' village adjacent to the Giza plateau, containing the remains of the people who built the pyramids, along with their tools, their food waste, their medical care facilities, and their administrative records, has given us a much more nuanced and, in some ways, more impressive picture. The workers who built the Great Pyramid were not slaves. They were paid, fed, housed, and provided with medical attention. The animal bones found in their village indicate a diet that was, by ancient standards, quite good: beef, sheep, goat, fish. The skeletal remains show evidence of serious injuries, construction injuries, the kind of trauma you get from moving very heavy stones, and also evidence of medical treatment, amputations that healed, bones that were set and knitted. Someone was caring for these workers. Someone was providing them with food of a quality that workers of their status in most ancient societies did not receive. The construction of the Great Pyramid was not a slave project. It was a managed, organized, state-supported labor operation of extraordinary scale. How many workers? The estimates from the logistical analysis of the workers' village and the construction requirements of the pyramid suggest somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 people working in rotating shifts. Not the 100,000 of Herodotus, but still an enormous number. A workforce comparable to the largest modern construction projects. And the organization required to feed, house, and manage 30,000 workers, to supply the construction site with the correct stones in the correct quantities at the correct times, to maintain the quality and precision of the work across millions of individual operations. This organization implies an administrative and logistical capacity that we should not underestimate. The state that built the Great Pyramid was not a primitive state. It was a sophisticated, complex, highly organized political and administrative structure capable of mobilizing enormous resources and maintaining them over the years required for construction. Whether that state was the Egypt of Khufu and the Fourth Dynasty, as the conventional account says, or whether it was something earlier, something we have not yet found direct evidence of, that is the question. And it is one we will continue to sit with as the night goes on. Before we go deeper into the pyramid itself, I want to spend some time with its neighbor. The Great Sphinx of Giza sits approximately 400 meters east of the Great Pyramid, carved from the living limestone of the plateau, facing due east towards the rising sun. It is enormous, 73 meters long, 20 meters tall, with a face that has been damaged by weather and, at some point in history, deliberately mutilated. The nose is gone. The beard that once adorned the chin now lies in fragments in the Cairo Museum and the British Museum. The Sphinx is old. Everyone agrees on that. The question, and it is a question that cuts directly to the heart of tonight's video, is how old? The conventional Egyptological dating places the Sphinx in the reign of Khufu's son and successor, Khafra, at approximately 2500 BCE. The basis for this dating is primarily stylistic and contextual. The Sphinx is associated with the Sphinx Temple and the Valley Temple, which are built in the same style as the funerary complex of Khafra. The face of the Sphinx, despite its damage, is thought by some Egyptologists to resemble the known portrait statues of Khafra. And the Sphinx is aligned with the causeway of Khafra's pyramid in a way that suggests it was part of his funerary complex. These are reasonable arguments. They are not conclusive. stylistic dating is inherently imprecise. The facial resemblance is disputed, and alignment with a causeway does not prove contemporaneous construction, but they are reasonable. Then, in 1990, a geologist named Robert Schoch climbed into the Sphinx enclosure and looked at the walls. Schoch is a professor of natural science at Boston University, a specialist in stratigraphy and the geological dating of ancient sites. He was brought to Giza by the researcher John Anthony West, who had been arguing since the 1970s, based on the work of the French mathematician and Egyptologist René Schwaller de Lubitsch, that the erosion pattern on the Sphinx and the Sphinx enclosure was inconsistent with wind and sand erosion, and more consistent with water erosion. Rainwater. Prolonged heavy rain. Schoch looked at the walls of the enclosure, the rock faces surrounding the Sphinx, exposed when the limestone was quarried to create the body of the monument. And he agreed with West. The pattern of erosion he saw was not the horizontal, wind-driven erosion characteristic of desert sites. It was vertical, deep undulating channels, and rounded weathering profiles of the kind produced by water running down a surface over a very long time. The Giza Plateau has received negligible rainfall for at least 4,000 years. The Sahara, once fertile, became the desert we know it as today through a gradual drying process that was largely complete by around 3,500 BCE. Before that, in the period known as the African Humid Period, or the Green Sahara, the region received significantly more rainfall. But the African Humid Period ended thousands of years before the conventional date of the Sphinx's construction. If the erosion on the Sphinx enclosure was produced by rainfall, Schoch argued, then the Sphinx was built, or at least the enclosure was cut, during a period when the climate of the Giza region was substantially wetter than it has been for the past 4,000 years. And that period, based on the paleoclimatological record, ended somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 years ago at the latest, possibly much earlier. This argument, presented at the 1992 annual meeting of the Geological Society of America, produced immediate controversy. Egyptologists rejected it. Geologists, several of whom examined Schoch's analysis, were more divided. Some accepted the water erosion interpretation. Others proposed alternative explanations. The debate has continued for more than 3 decades, and it has not been fully resolved. The Egyptological objections to Schoch's argument are worth taking seriously because they are not merely territorial resistance to an outsider's claim. The most substantive objection is that the erosion pattern on the Sphinx can be explained by mechanisms other than prolonged rainfall. One alternative is that the Sphinx enclosure collected wind-blown sand that retained moisture during periods of higher humidity, producing a wetter microenvironment than the surrounding desert. Another is that the deep weathering profiles reflect variations in the quality of the limestone itself rather than differential erosion by water. The Egyptologist Mark Lehner, one of the world's leading authorities on Giza and someone who has spent decades excavating the plateau, accepts that some of the erosion features on the Sphinx enclosure are unusual, but does not accept the interpretation that they require a pre-4th Dynasty construction date. He has proposed that the evidence is consistent with the conventional dating, and that the apparent water erosion features can be explained within the context of known Egyptian climate history. Schoch has responded to these objections in detail in subsequent publications, maintaining that the water erosion interpretation is the most parsimonious explanation for the features he observed. The argument is genuinely technical. It involves the interpretation of specific weathering profiles, the chemistry of limestone dissolution, the microclimate of the enclosure, and it is not easily adjudicated by non-specialists. What I want to say about it, honestly, is this. The Sphinx erosion argument is not proven. it has not achieved scientific consensus. It faces legitimate objections from serious scholars who have studied the site in detail. But it has also not been definitively refuted. The alternative explanations for the erosion features are plausible, but none of them has been demonstrated to be sufficient to account for all the features Schoch identified. The debate continues because the evidence is genuinely ambiguous, and the implications, if Schoch is right, are enormous. If the Sphinx was constructed during the African humid period, if the enclosure was cut at a time when the Giza plateau was receiving enough rainfall to produce the erosion profiles Schoch identifies, then the Sphinx is not 4,500 years old. It is at minimum 7,000 years old, and quite possibly 10,000 or older. And if the Sphinx is that old, then whatever civilization built it is also that old. Which means that there was a culture in the Nile Valley capable of conceiving and executing a monument of the Sphinx's scale and sophistication at a time that precedes the conventional beginning of Egyptian civilization by thousands of years. This would not prove that the Great Pyramid is also older than conventionally dated. The Sphinx and the pyramid are separate structures, and the dating of one does not automatically determine the dating of the other. But it would establish, in a way that the conventional timeline does not, the possibility of sophisticated monument building in Egypt long before the pharaohs. And it would change the question we are asking about the pyramid from, why does this structure seem anomalously sophisticated for its stated date? To, what was the civilization that produced it, and how long had it been developing before the Fourth Dynasty appeared in the historical record? Now let me tell you about the stars. In 1989, a Belgian-born engineer named Robert Bauval was lying in the Sahara desert on a camping trip, looking up at the night sky, when he noticed something. The three belt stars of the constellation Orion, Alnitak, Alnilam, and Mintaka, are not perfectly aligned. They form a slightly curved line with the leftmost star offset slightly from the line formed by the other two. And Bauval, looking at the stars and then looking at a map of the Giza plateau, noticed that the three pyramids of Giza share exactly this arrangement. The two large pyramids, Khufu's and Khafra's, are aligned diagonally on the plateau. The third pyramid, Menkaur's, significantly smaller than the other two, is offset to the left from the line formed by the larger two, precisely as Mintaka, the leftmost belt star, is offset from the line formed by Alnitak and Alnilam. This correspondence between the arrangement of the three Giza pyramids and the arrangement of Orion's belt stars is known as the Orion correlation theory, and Bauval has been developing and defending it since his 1994 book, The Orion Mystery, brought it to wide public attention. The Orion correlation is striking at first glance. Three monuments on the ground arranged in the same pattern as three stars in the sky. The natural question is whether the arrangement is intentional, whether the builders of Giza deliberately positioned the three pyramids to mirror the belt of Orion. There are reasons to think it might be intentional that go beyond the visual correspondence. The ancient Egyptians had a deep and specific relationship with Orion. In Egyptian astronomy and religion, the constellation was associated with Osiris, the god of death, resurrection, and the afterlife. Orion's rising in the eastern sky was associated with the renewal of life. The pyramid texts, the religious inscriptions found in the later pyramids, contain explicit references to the pharaoh's soul ascending to the stars of Orion after death. If the Giza pyramids were built to mirror the belt of Orion, to create on the ground a map of the sky that was associated with the afterlife and the soul's journey, then the alignment is not just aesthetically pleasing, it is theologically purposeful. Bauval has also argued that the correspondence extends beyond the three belt stars. The Milky Way, he suggests, corresponds to the Nile, the river of the sky mirroring the river of the earth. The other pyramids of the Giza plateau and the wider Memphite necropolis correspond to other stars in the Orion constellation region. The entire layout of the monuments in this reading is a map of the sky projected onto the earth. The astronomical objection to the correspondence is interesting. When you run a precession-corrected sky simulation and look at where Orion's belt was at the time of the pyramid's conventional construction date, circa 2500 BCE, the belt stars do not match the pyramid arrangement as well as they do at a different date. The correspondence is significantly better at a date much earlier, specifically around 10,500 BCE. 10,500 BCE is 12,500 years ago, a date deep in the Ice Age, before agriculture, before pottery, before any of the settled cultures whose remains we can study. Bauval and Graham Hancock, developing this argument in their 1996 book Keeper of Genesis, proposed that the Giza Plateau was laid out at 10,500 BCE. That the original plan of the monuments was conceived and perhaps partially implemented at this extremely early date, and that what we see on the plateau today is the realization, thousands of years later, of a much more ancient design. This is a bold claim. The mainstream Egyptological response has been that the correspondence at 10,500 BCE is not actually better than at other dates when the calculations are done carefully, that the geometry of the pyramid layout works reasonably well at multiple dates. Bauval and Hancock have maintained their position, arguing that the critics have not accounted for all the relevant astronomical features. The debate, like the Sphinx erosion debate, has been running for decades without resolution. What I want to draw your attention to is not the specific date claim, which remains contested, but the underlying logic. The ancient Egyptians understood the sky as a map. They understood the earth as a mirror of the sky. The concept of Tepi, the first time, the mythological era when the gods established the pattern for everything that followed, is about precisely this. A moment when the celestial and the terrestrial were perfectly aligned when the sky was properly reflected in the earth. If the Giza monuments are an attempt to replicate a celestial configuration, to create on the earth a permanent mirror of a specific sky, then the sky configuration they are mirroring is meaningful. It corresponds to a specific date, and that date, whether 10,500 BCE or some other date, tells us something about what the builders understood themselves to be doing. They were not just building a tomb, they were building a map, a permanent terrestrial representation of a specific moment in cosmic time. What moment? What time? What did the sky look like at the moment they considered most significant? That question is one of the threads we will keep pulling on as the night continues. Let me turn now to the stones themselves, because the physical reality of the Sphinx temple and the Valley temple raises questions that are independent of the astronomical hypotheses. These temples are built from limestone blocks of extraordinary size. Not the 2.5-ton average blocks of the pyramid, but enormous monolithic stones weighing tens, and in some cases hundreds of tons. The largest blocks in the Valley Temple are estimated to weigh up to 200 tons. They are cut from the limestone of the Sphinx enclosure itself, the same stone removed to expose the body of the Sphinx, and transported from the enclosure to be incorporated into the temple walls. 200 tons. To give you a sense of scale, a fully loaded Boeing 747 weighs approximately 400 tons. The largest blocks in the Valley Temple weigh half of that. They are not columns or blocks in the ordinary sense. They are sections of cliff face, moved and placed with a precision that the construction methods we can document for the Fourth Dynasty do not easily explain. The logistics of moving such blocks without wheeled vehicles without powerful machinery over even short distances, is a genuine unsolved engineering problem. The mechanisms proposed by Egyptologists work well for the pyramid's moderately sized blocks, but strain credibility as block size increases into the hundreds of tons. How were these blocks moved? We do not know, not with confidence. And this unknown matters, because the Valley Temple is one of the structures most closely associated with the Sphinx. If the Sphinx is older than the conventional dating, the Valley Temple, which appears to have been built from the material removed when the Sphinx enclosure was cut, may be older too. There is a carved inscription known as the Inventory Stele, found near the Giza Plateau and now in the Cairo Museum, that has been dated to the late period of Egyptian history, roughly 1,000 years after the 4th Dynasty. The inscription records the activities of Khufu at Giza, and it specifically states that Khufu repaired the Sphinx and the temples near it, implying that these structures already existed when Khufu arrived. This inscription is contested. Mainstream Egyptologists argue that the Inventory Stele is a late-period composition that used anachronistic language or reflected later traditions, and that its historical reliability for the Old Kingdom period is limited. This is a legitimate methodological argument. Late-period inscriptions referencing events from 2,000 years earlier cannot simply be taken at face value. But the inscription says what it says. And what it says is that Khufu found the Sphinx and its temples already standing at Giza. That he did not build them, but maintained them. If that is true, if the Inventory Stele is preserving a genuine historical memory, then the Sphinx and the Valley Temple predate the 4th Dynasty, which means they were built by someone else in an era we have not yet identified. And then the question becomes, who? That question, who built the monuments of Giza and when and what did they know, is the question that has animated this debate for decades and that we will continue to inhabit tonight. The conventional answer is the 4th Dynasty Egyptians, and it is supported by substantial evidence that we should not dismiss. But the anomalies are real. The erosion is real. The astronomical correspondences are real. The engineering challenges are real. The Inventory Stele is real. All of these things require explanation, and the explanations the conventional account offers are not always as satisfying as the confident textbook summaries suggest. Let's keep looking. There is a particular problem with the conventional account of the Great Pyramid that I have not yet fully articulated, and I want to spend some time with it before we move on. The problem is not any single piece of evidence. It is the accumulation of them, the precision of the alignment, the encoding of mathematical relationships, the empty king's chamber with its uninscribed granite walls, the enormous blocks of the Valley Temple with their unclear method of transport, the erosion on the Sphinx enclosure, the astronomical correspondences that are better at an earlier date than the conventional one. The inventory. Stele's implication that Khufu found the Sphinx already there. None of these, individually, is sufficient to overturn the conventional account. Each one has an explanation that is consistent with the 4th Dynasty dating. But the accumulation of them, the sheer number of things that require special pleading or individual explanation within the conventional framework, produces a weight of anomaly that is worth taking seriously. This is how paradigms shift in science and archaeology. Not through a single decisive refutation, but through the accumulation of anomalies that the existing framework cannot elegantly accommodate. At some point, the explanatory burden of maintaining the conventional account exceeds the explanatory benefit, and a new account is developed that handles the evidence more naturally. Are we at that point with the Great Pyramid? I don't think so. The evidence for the conventional account is substantial, and the alternative accounts are not yet coherent enough or well evidenced enough to replace it. But we may be approaching it. The anomalies are real. The questions are legitimate. And the researchers asking them, even those who have sometimes made claims that go beyond the evidence, are responding to genuine puzzles that the conventional account does not fully resolve. Let me also spend some time with the question of what was happening in Egypt before the Fourth Dynasty, because this context is important for evaluating the alternative accounts. The conventional timeline of Egyptian civilization begins with the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under the First Dynasty pharaoh Narmer at approximately 3100 BCE. Before that is the Pre-Dynastic period, stretching back several thousand years, during which the cultures of the Nile Valley were developing toward the complex civilization that the First Dynasty represents. The pre-dynastic cultures of Egypt, the Badarian, the Naqada, the Amratian, show a progressive development of complexity. Early small agricultural villages growing into larger settlements, developing increasingly sophisticated pottery, jewelry, and burial practices, eventually producing the administrative and artistic traditions that underlie historical Egypt. This developmental sequence is well documented archaeologically. It is a genuine progression with each phase building on the previous one that leads naturally to the organized hierarchical state of the early dynastic period. But here is the thing that the alternative researchers have always pointed at. The historical period of Egypt, the period of pharaohs, pyramids, hieroglyphic writing, complex bureaucracy, appears in the archaeological record with a speed and completeness that the pre-dynastic development does not fully prepare you for. The First and Second Dynasties show extraordinary sophistication. By the Third Dynasty, with the step pyramid of Djoser, the architectural tradition that culminates at Giza is already well advanced. This rapid flowering has been explained by mainstream Egyptology as an acceleration driven by the political and economic opportunities created by the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. The concentration of resources and organizational capacity that a unified state could bring to bear on the development of technology and art. That is a plausible explanation, but it requires Egypt to have gone from relatively modest pre-dynastic villages to one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the ancient world in a remarkably short time. The speed of the transition is not impossible, but it is fast. Some researchers, John Anthony West, Graham Hancock, Robert Bauval, have argued that the speed of the transition makes more sense if Egyptian civilization had deeper roots than the conventional account acknowledges. If there was an earlier phase of Egyptian development, perhaps connected to the cultures of the Sahara before it dried, or to communities along the Nile before the sea level stabilized and the delta took its current form, that provided the foundation for the historical period's remarkable achievement. This earlier phase, if it existed, has left few archaeological traces. The drying of the Sahara, the rise of the Nile delta's sea level, and thousands of years of subsequent occupation have destroyed or buried whatever material remains it may have left. Except perhaps for the Sphinx, and perhaps for the Great Pyramid. The idea that the monuments of Giza represent the visible tip of an iceberg, the part of a much older civilizational tradition that survived into the historical period, is not provable from the current evidence. It may never be provable if the earlier material is too thoroughly destroyed or buried to recover. But it is consistent with the evidence we do have. It resolves the anomalies more elegantly than the conventional account does. And it is the kind of hypothesis that should be taken seriously rather than dismissed, precisely because it is the kind of hypothesis that the evidence is pointing toward. Whether it is correct, whether there is an older Egypt beneath the Egypt we know, is a question for the archaeology of the future, for the underwater excavations that are not yet technically feasible, for the remote sensing surveys that are beginning to reveal features beneath the sands of the Sahara and the silt of the Nile Delta. For the researchers who will bring tools we do not yet have to questions we are only beginning to articulate clearly. We are at the beginning of understanding Giza, not the end, and that beginning, in the small hours of the night, feels like exactly the right place to be. Let's talk about what it actually takes to build the Great Pyramid, not in the abstract sense of marveling at ancient achievement, though marveling is appropriate, but in the specific, practical, engineering sense. What are the problems that need to be solved? How have they been solved in the mainstream account? And where do those solutions run into difficulty? The Great Pyramid contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks. The average weight of these blocks is about 2.5 tons, roughly the weight of a small car. The largest blocks used in the internal chambers and their supporting structures weigh up to 80 tons, and the granite blocks of the King's Chamber, brought from Aswan, 800 kilometers to the south, are precisely cut and fitted with tolerances of fractions of a millimeter. The construction of the pyramid took, according to the conventional estimate, approximately 20 years. 20 years to quarry, transport, and precisely place 2.3 million blocks. That works out to approximately 315 blocks placed every day. Every single day for 20 years, assuming no days off, no delays, no time for mistakes and corrections. In practice, of course, there would have been periods of more intensive activity and periods of less. The Nile flood season, when agriculture was impossible and the workforce was available for construction, was the peak construction period, and the quarrying and transport of stone could continue year-round. But the basic arithmetic of what the construction required remains daunting. How was it done? The mainstream explanation involves a combination of methods that are individually well attested in ancient Egyptian construction, and collectively, it is argued, sufficient to account for the pyramid's construction. For the transportation of blocks from the quarries, water transport was used where possible. The limestone from Tura was quarried across the Nile and transported by barge to the Giza plateau. The granite from Aswan was transported down the Nile by boat, a distance of 800 kilometers that the Nile's current would have made manageable. The final transport from the water's edge to the construction site used wooden sledges, lubricated with water, a technique well documented in Egyptian paintings and confirmed by the discovery of a painted scene at the quarry of Hatnub, showing workers using ropes and a sledge to move a massive alabaster block. For the raising of the blocks to the appropriate level in the pyramid, the mainstream explanation involves ramps, specifically some kind of inclined ramp of compacted rubble and mud that would allow workers to drag the blocks on sledges from the ground to the required height. The specific design of the construction ramp, how it was built, how it changed as the pyramid grew, is the most debated engineering question in Egyptology. Several designs have been proposed. A single straight ramp extending from the base of the pyramid to the current working level would, at the height required to reach the upper courses of the pyramid, have to be so long and so massive that it would itself be one of the largest construction projects in the ancient world. Some calculations suggest that a straight ramp long enough to serve the pyramid at its full height would require almost as much material as the pyramid itself. A spiral ramp winding around the outside of the pyramid as it grew avoids the volume problem but creates serious practical difficulties. The ramp would obscure the pyramid's corners, the precise alignment points needed to maintain the pyramid's geometry, making it impossible to check the accuracy of construction as it progressed. An interior ramp, concealed within the body of the pyramid itself, has been proposed by the French architect Jean-Pierre Houdin, who has developed a detailed model showing how a spiral ramp inside the pyramid could have been used for the upper courses after an external ramp had been used for the lower courses. Houdin's model is ingenious and has attracted serious attention, and there is some evidence from muon tomography, a technique that uses cosmic ray particles to image the interior of large structures, that is consistent with the presence of a helical void inside the pyramid. But the evidence is not conclusive. The honest answer to how the pyramid was built is, we know the general approach: ramps, sledges, water lubrication, massive organized workforce. But the specific details of how the ramp system worked, how the precision was maintained, and how certain specific engineering challenges were overcome have not been fully resolved. One specific challenge that deserves particular attention is the precision of the granite work. The granite blocks of the king's chamber and its antechamber are cut and fitted with a precision that is, by the standards of ancient construction, extraordinary. The joints between adjacent blocks are so tight that, in many cases, you cannot insert a piece of paper between them. The surfaces of the blocks are smooth and flat to tolerances that, in modern terms, are comparable to high-quality machined surfaces. Achieving this precision with copper tools, the hardest metal available to 4th Dynasty Egyptians, who did not have iron or bronze in significant quantities, is technically challenging. Copper is significantly softer than granite. Copper chisels striking granite would blunt quickly and would leave a rougher surface than the finished blocks display. The tools used for the finest granite work at Giza are a subject of ongoing debate. Copper saws with abrasive sand have been proposed and demonstrated to be capable of cutting granite. Slowly and with great difficulty, but capable of it. Harder stone tools, dolerite, which is harder than granite, could have been used for roughing out the blocks, and the final polishing could have been achieved with increasingly fine abrasives over long periods of time. None of these methods is impossible, but collectively achieving the precision of the king's chamber granite work using only the tools conventionally attributed to the 4th dynasty would have required an enormous investment of time and skill, more, some engineers have argued, than the 20-year construction timeline easily accommodates. The alternative researchers have proposed that the precision of the granite work implies the use of advanced tools, rotary saws or drills with harder cutting edges than copper, that the conventional account does not acknowledge. The Egyptologist and engineer Dennis Stocks has done extensive experimental work on ancient Egyptian stoneworking, and has generally concluded that copper tools with abrasive sand can achieve finer results than the alternative researchers allow. But the debate about the specific capabilities of ancient Egyptian toolmakers continues. Let me turn now to the shafts, because they are among the most mysterious and most discussed features of the pyramid. The king's chamber and the queen's chamber each have 2 shafts, narrow passages, approximately 20 centimeters square, that penetrate through the body of the pyramid at specific angles. 2 shafts from the king's chamber exit through the north and south faces of the pyramid. 2 shafts from the queen's chamber do not reach the surface. They were sealed at both ends and were unknown until 1872, when a British engineer named Wayneman Dixon noticed a crack in the queen's chamber wall and inserted a wire that disappeared into a void. The shafts have been the subject of intense study and speculation since their discovery. Their angles are specific and appear to have been carefully calculated. When you trace the shafts outward from their chambers and project their angles against the star positions of the sky, as it appeared in approximately 2500 BCE, the conventional construction date, they point to specific stars. The southern shaft of the king's chamber pointed to Orion's belt, specifically to the star Alnitak, the lowest of the 3 belt stars. At its meridian crossing in approximately 2500 BCE. This is consistent with the Osiris-Orion association, and with the idea that the shaft was designed to align with the stars of Osiris at the time of the pyramid's construction. The northern shaft of the king's chamber pointed to Thuban, the star in Draco that was the pole star of the era, the star closest to the celestial North Pole in 2500 BCE. A shaft pointing to the pole star makes sense in the context of Egyptian beliefs about the pharaoh's afterlife journey, in which the soul was understood to ascend to the circumpolar stars. The stars that never set, that move around the pole in eternal circles, and thus symbolize eternal life. The shafts of the Queen's chamber, when projected outward, point to the star Sirius in the south, the star associated with the goddess Isis and with the annual Nile flood, and toward the constellation of Ursa Minor in the north. Robert Bauval identified these stellar alignments in the early 1990s, and they have been confirmed by subsequent astronomical analysis. The alignments are real. The question is what they mean, whether the shafts were functional telescopes for stargazing, ritual passageways for the pharaoh's soul, simple alignment markers, or something else entirely. And then there is the matter of what is at the end of the Queen's chamber shafts. In 1993, a German engineer named Rudolf Gantenbrink sent a small robot called Upuaut 2 up the southern shaft of the Queen's chamber. The shaft had never been fully explored. It was too small for a person to enter, too long and too angled for ordinary investigation. The robot, equipped with a camera and lights, crawled up the shaft for 63 meters and then stopped. It stopped because there was a door, a small stone slab fitted with 2 copper handles, blocking the shaft at a point 63 meters from the chamber. The slab was not a feature of the shaft's construction. It was not part of the original passage. It had been placed there deliberately, blocking access to whatever lay beyond. Gantenbrink's discovery caused an immediate sensation. A sealed door inside the Great Pyramid, in a shaft that pointed to the star Sirius. What was behind it? The answer, when a camera was eventually threaded through a small hole drilled in the slab by a team from the National Geographic Society in 2002, nearly a decade after Gantenbrink's discovery, was anticlimactic. A small chamber, approximately 20 centimeters deep, another stone slab at the far end, and on the floor some fragments of material that analysis later suggested were probably wood and a few copper items. The chamber was empty, or nearly so. The door had protected nothing of obvious significance. Or had it? The debate about what the Queen's chamber shaft door represents has continued since 2002. Some researchers argue that the small chamber is simply a dead end, a construction feature with no deeper significance. Others argue that the second slab beyond the small chamber is another door, and that a more thorough investigation of what lies beyond it has still not been conducted. The Great Pyramid contains secrets that have not yet been fully revealed. That is not a dramatic claim or an alternative theory. It is simply a fact about the state of the exploration. In 2017, a major international project called Scan Pyramids used non-invasive scanning technologies, infrared thermography, cosmic ray muon detection, and ground-penetrating radar to study the internal structure of the Great Pyramid without drilling or excavating. The results included the announcement of a significant void, a cavity larger than the Grand Gallery, located above the Grand Gallery in the upper portions of the pyramid. The discovery of a large, previously unknown void inside the Great Pyramid is extraordinary. It does not prove anything about the pyramid's date or its builders, but it confirms that we do not yet know everything that is inside the monument, that 12,000 years after its construction, or 4,500 years if you accept the conventional date, the pyramid still contains undiscovered spaces. What is in that void? We do not know. The Scan Pyramids team has been careful not to speculate beyond their data. The void exists. Its purpose and contents are unknown. The Great Pyramid keeps its secrets well. Let me say something about the acoustic properties of the King's Chamber, because this is an aspect of the pyramid that is rarely discussed in the popular literature, but that I find genuinely fascinating. The King's Chamber is built of granite, a material that, unlike limestone, has specific acoustic properties. When you are inside the King's Chamber and make a sound, any sound, from a clap to a sustained note to a resonant hum, the room responds. The granite walls and ceiling produce a complex resonance, a sustained vibration that interacts with the sound source in ways that are immediately noticeable and that researchers have found to have specific properties. John Reed, an acoustic engineer, made measurements inside the King's Chamber in 1997 and found that the room resonates most strongly at specific frequencies that correspond to the bass range of the human voice, to the range of certain percussion instruments, to the frequencies used in some forms of ritual chanting. The acoustic properties of the King's Chamber are not unique among ancient sacred spaces. Many ancient temples and stone chambers have been found to have specific resonant properties, and some researchers have argued that these properties were deliberately designed into the spaces for ritual purposes. But the King's Chamber's acoustics are particularly striking, partly because of the precision of the granite construction, and partly because the room's specific dimensions produce a resonance that is unusually rich and sustained. What does this mean for understanding the pyramid? Possibly nothing. The resonant properties may be incidental to the construction rather than deliberately designed, but possibly something. If the King's Chamber was designed to produce specific acoustic effects, to create a sonic environment that enhanced or facilitated specific ritual practices, then the pyramid's function was not simply architectural, it was experiential in a very specific sense. The room was built to do something to the people inside it, to produce an experience, visual, acoustic, perhaps spatial, that was part of the pyramid's purpose. What was that purpose? We have established that the conventional explanation, a tomb, does not fully account for the evidence. The King's Chamber is not well designed as a tomb. It has no inscriptions, no mummy, no funerary goods. The sarcophagus cannot be sealed. The room's acoustic properties are irrelevant to the storage and protection of a body. But the acoustic properties are not irrelevant to the living. To someone standing in the room, chanting or drumming or simply humming at the right frequency, the room's resonance would have been immediately and powerfully apparent. The experience of being inside a space that responds to you, that amplifies and sustains your voice in specific ways, is unlike ordinary architectural experience. It is the experience of being inside an instrument. The Great Pyramid in this reading was not a tomb. It was a machine, or perhaps more accurately, an instrument, designed to produce specific experiences in the people who used it. What experiences, and what those experiences were for, we cannot say with certainty. But the precision of the construction, the specific geometry of the chambers, the acoustic properties of the King's Chamber, all of these are consistent with a building designed not just to stand, but to do something. What that something was is one of the most open and most interesting questions about the most studied monument in the world. And it is one we will keep inhabiting as the night continues. I want to spend more time with the engineering questions, because they are at the heart of the alternative history argument, and they deserve careful treatment. The specific problem that most alternative researchers focus on is not the average block, the 2.5-ton limestone blocks that make up the bulk of the pyramid's mass. these blocks are large and numerous, but their transport and placement is at least broadly explicable within the conventional framework of ramps, sledges, and organized labor. The problem is the exceptional blocks, the ones that challenge the conventional explanation most directly. The king's chamber ceiling is formed from 9 enormous granite beams, each weighing approximately 40 to 70 tons. These beams span the full width of the chamber, approximately 5.5 meters, and support the weight of the pyramid above them. Above these beams are 4 more sets of granite beams in the stress-relieving chambers above the king's chamber, and a final peaked gabled ceiling of limestone blocks. The total weight that the granite beams must support is estimated at hundreds of thousands of tons. The precision with which these beams are fitted is extraordinary. They are not rough-hewn structural members. They are carefully finished granite, fitted tightly against the limestone walls and against each other, with surfaces that are smooth enough to suggest careful preparation. How were these 40 to 70-ton granite beams raised into position inside the pyramid at a height of approximately 60 meters above the pyramid's base? The construction of the stress-relieving chambers required placing these beams after the king's chamber walls were already built. They could not be slid in from the side. They had to be raised from below, through the interior of the pyramid, in a space that was increasingly constrained as the pyramid grew around it. The conventional explanation is that the stress-relieving chambers were built as part of the normal construction sequence, that the beams were placed at each stage as the pyramid rose, with each set of beams being placed before the courses above them were laid. This is plausible in principle, but in practice, raising 40-ton granite beams through the interior of a partially constructed pyramid in a space that was increasingly enclosed, with the ramp system still in operation outside. This is an engineering challenge of extraordinary complexity. No one has built a detailed, physically verified reconstruction of how this specific operation was accomplished. The general framework of ramps and sledges is asserted, but the specific sequence of operations has not been demonstrated. This is not, to be clear, evidence that the conventional account is wrong. Absence of a detailed reconstruction does not mean the construction was impossible. Engineers are confident that the methods were available in principle. But the gap between in principle and in practice is where the most interesting questions live. Now let me talk about the casing stones, because they tell a story that is rarely told in the popular accounts of the pyramid. The Great Pyramid originally had a smooth, gleaming outer surface, a shell of fine white Tura limestone fitted over the stepped core that would have made the pyramid appear as a single continuous surface from base to apex. This casing was the pyramid as its builders intended it to be seen, not the rough steps of exposed core blocks that tourists see today, but a smooth white mountain of stone rising from the desert plateau, catching the light. Almost all of this casing is gone. Over the centuries, and particularly after a major earthquake damaged the Cairo region in 1303 CE, the casing stones were stripped from the pyramid and used as building material for mosques, palaces, and other structures in Cairo. The Mosque of Ibn Tulun in Cairo and numerous other medieval buildings contain limestone that was once part of the Great Pyramid's outer casing. What remains of the original casing, a few stones at the base of the north face, discovered by archaeologists in the 19th century, shows the precision of the work. The casing stones are fitted against each other and against the core with joints so fine that no mortar was needed. The surfaces are smooth and flat. The angles are precise. The Egyptologist Flinders Petrie, who made the first systematic measurements of the pyramid in the 1880s, found that the average deviation from perfect flatness in the surviving casing stone joints was approximately 0.02 of a millimeter. This is a precision comparable to modern optical glass polishing. It is significantly finer than anything achievable with the grinding tools conventionally attributed to the Old Kingdom. How was this precision achieved? The conventional answer is patient grinding and fitting. The stones were progressively refined and fitted against each other through a process of repeated checking and adjustment. This is technically plausible, but it requires an enormous investment of time and skill for every single casing stone, multiplied across the tens of thousands of casing stones that covered the pyramid. The alternative researchers have argued that precision of this quality implies the use of tools or methods not yet identified. That the conventional account underestimates the technological sophistication of the builders. This argument is hard to evaluate definitively because the specific tools that were used have not been found, and the limits of what Copper Age technology could achieve have not been exhaustively tested. What we can say is that the precision of the casing stones is real, and that it is genuinely remarkable, and that any complete account of the pyramid's construction must explain it. Let me also spend time with the mortar. The Great Pyramid's construction used enormous quantities of mortar, gypsum mortar, which is relatively weak by modern standards, but which served to lubricate the blocks as they were placed, and to fill minor irregularities in the joint surfaces. Analysis of this mortar has been used as one of the dating tools for the pyramid. The specific chemical composition and the carbon-14 dating of organic materials in the mortar provide evidence about when the mortar was made. These mortar dates are one of the more robust lines of evidence for the pyramid's conventional age. The radiocarbon dates obtained from organic material in the pyramid's mortar have generally been consistent with the 4th Dynasty dating, though with a spread that extends several centuries on either side. The mortar dates do not prove that Khufu built the pyramid. They prove that mortar was applied to the pyramid at approximately the time of the 4th Dynasty. A pyramid that was originally built earlier and then restored or completed during the 4th Dynasty would produce similar mortar dates from the Restoration mortar, while the original construction would be older. This distinction between original construction dates and Restoration mortar dates is subtle but important. It is precisely the kind of distinction that the alternative researchers have emphasized, and it is a legitimate methodological point. The mortar dates do not eliminate the possibility of an earlier construction date. They simply limit what can be inferred from them. The honest position on the dating evidence for the Great Pyramid is this. The evidence is consistent with the conventional 4th Dynasty date. It is also consistent with an earlier original construction that was completed or significantly modified during the 4th Dynasty. The evidence does not strongly distinguish between these two scenarios. And that ambiguity, that genuine uncertainty about what the evidence actually proves, is the space in which the debate lives. Let me spend a moment with the Grand Gallery itself, because it is one of the most extraordinary architectural spaces in the ancient world, and it deserves more attention than it usually receives. The Grand Gallery is 47 meters long and 8.5 meters tall. It rises at an angle of 26 degrees, the same angle as the pyramid's faces, connecting the horizontal ascending passage to the antechamber of the king's chamber. The corbelled walls step inward at 7 successive levels, each course of stone projecting approximately 7.5 centimeters beyond the one below, until the walls meet at the top in a ceiling just under 1 meter wide. Built into the floor of the Grand Gallery are 2 ramps, one on each side with a central channel between them. In the ramps are a series of rectangular notches, 27 on each side, regularly spaced. These notches clearly held something. What they held is unknown. Various proposals have been made. Wooden beams that supported a ramp mechanism for raising blocks into the king's chamber. Scaffolding supports for the construction of the corbelled ceiling. Ritual objects placed in the gallery after construction. none of these proposals has been definitively confirmed. The corbelled ceiling of the Grand Gallery is itself a feat of engineering. The successive cantilevering of heavy stone courses, each one projecting beyond the one below, creates a self-supporting arch without the use of a true arch. A technique that distributes the load in ways that have allowed the gallery to survive 4,500 years without significant structural distress. And the acoustics of the Grand Gallery are extraordinary. More than twice as tall as it is wide, lined with flat granite surfaces, rising at a steep angle. The gallery produces a resonance that is unlike any ordinary corridor or passage. Sound introduced at the lower end of the gallery travels upward and is amplified and sustained by the corbelled surfaces in ways that researchers who have studied the pyramid's acoustics describe as remarkable. If the Grand Gallery was used for ritual purposes, if it was a space designed to be experienced rather than simply traversed, then its acoustic properties would have been immediately apparent to anyone who entered it. The experience of moving up a steeply inclined passage, enclosed by progressively narrowing walls, in a space that amplifies every sound, that responds to your footsteps and your voice in ways that feel almost alive. This is an experience designed to affect the person undergoing it. What was the Grand Gallery for? The conventional answer is that it was an access passage to the king's chamber. But architectural passages do not need to be 8.5 meters tall. They do not need to be lined with corbelled granite. They do not need to be acoustically extraordinary. The Grand Gallery is over-engineered for a simple corridor. The excess, the height, the corbelling, the acoustics, suggests that the space was designed to be something more than a means of getting from one room to another. What more? That question, like so many of the Great Pyramid's questions, remains genuinely open, but sitting with the openness of it, in the quiet of the night, is itself worthwhile. We are inside the most studied building in the world, and we are still finding questions that have not been answered, still finding spaces whose purpose is not fully understood, still finding evidence that suggests the builders of this monument were doing something more complex, more deliberate, more intentional than building a very large tomb for a pharaoh. Whatever they were building, they built it extraordinarily well, and it has lasted. Let me tell you what the ancient Egyptians themselves said about the age of their civilization. Not what the Greeks said about Egypt. The Greeks were impressed, occasionally confused, and prone to filling gaps in their knowledge with elaboration. Not what the Roman tourists who carved their names into the monuments said. Not what the Arab scholars who studied Egypt in the medieval period said. What the Egyptians said, in their own texts, in their own language, about their own past. The answer is more interesting and more relevant to the question we are sitting with tonight than most popular accounts of ancient Egypt acknowledge. The ancient Egyptians believed their civilization was ancient in a way that the conventional timeline does not capture. They believed that before the historical period, before the pharaohs, before the dynasties, before the first unification under Nama, at around 3100 BCE, there had been an immensely long age during which gods ruled the earth directly. Not gods in a theological abstraction, not supernatural beings communicating through dreams and oracles, but gods physically present in the world, ruling as kings, managing the affairs of Egypt with a directness that later humans could only approximate. This age is called Zep Tepi, the first time or the primordial time, or sometimes translated as the first occasion. It is the mythological era before the historical era, the divine template on which all subsequent Egyptian civilization was understood to be modeled. The Zep Tepi is not simply a creation myth in the sense that Genesis is a creation myth, a story about the beginning of the world in an abstract or cosmic sense. It is a specific claim about Egyptian history, about a period when the world was already made, when humans already existed, but when the divine beings who preceded the pharaohs were still physically present and directly governing. After the Tepi, after some transition that the texts describe in various ways, involving the withdrawal of the gods from direct earthly rule, the human pharaohs took over. The pharaoh was not simply a human ruler. He was the representative of the divine order established in the Tepi, the human inheritor of a tradition that went back to the first time. His role was to maintain Ma'at, the cosmic order, the balance of the universe, in the way that the gods had maintained it before him. This is not mythology in the sense of fiction. For the ancient Egyptians, the Tepi was historical fact. The gods had ruled. The divine dynasties had preceded the human dynasties. What came before the pharaohs was not nothing. It was a long, organized, cosmologically significant age of direct, divine governance. The Turin King List is one of the most remarkable documents of the ancient world, and it is rarely discussed with the attention it deserves. The Turin Papyrus, now in the Museo Egizio in Turin, which is why it is called the Turin King List, or Turin Canon, is a papyrus document dating to the reign of Ramesses II, approximately 1200 BCE. It is one of the most complete lists of Egyptian pharaohs ever found, covering the entire span of Egyptian history from the legendary earliest rulers to the Second Intermediate Period. The beginning of the list is what concerns us tonight. The Turin King List does not begin with Nama or Menes, the conventional first pharaoh of the First Dynasty. It begins much earlier. It begins with a series of kings described as gods, the divine rulers of the Tepi, followed by a series of rulers called the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, who are described as semi-divine beings who ruled after the gods but before the human pharaohs. The reigns of the divine kings, as listed in the Turin document, are given in tens of thousands of years. The total reign of the gods, according to the list, extends to over 13,000 years, and the reign of the Shemsu Hor, the semi-divine intermediary rulers, adds thousands more years to the total. Only after these vast divine and semi-divine dynasties does the list arrive at the human pharaohs, beginning with Nama and proceeding through the dynastic history of Egypt in a form that is broadly consistent with what conventional Egyptology recognizes. This is the Egyptian version of the Sumerian King List. The parallel is extraordinary and has received less attention than it deserves. Both documents begin with rulers who reigned for impossibly long periods. In the divine age before the catastrophe or the transition that ended the divine era. Both documents then transition to shorter, more human-length reigns as they approach the historical period. Both documents treat the pre-historical period as historical, as a real sequence of rulers and reigns, not as mythology. We discussed the Sumerian King List at length in an earlier video. The 8 antediluvian kings who ruled for 432,000 years. The flood that ended the antediluvian age. The post-flood kings who began with 1,000-year reigns and gradually declined to human-length ones. The structural identity between the Sumerian tradition and the Egyptian tradition is not coincidence. These are two of the oldest literate civilizations in the world, producing independently the same basic claim, that before the historical period there was a much longer period of divine rule, that this divine period was ended by some transition or catastrophe, and that the human dynasties that followed were the inheritors of a tradition established in that earlier age. The conventional explanation for this parallel is that both documents reflect a universal human tendency to project the deep past as a golden age of divine rule, a psychological pattern rather than a historical claim. And this may be partly true. The longing for a lost golden age, the attribution of historical origins to divine beings, the understanding of the present as a diminished version of the past. These are indeed widespread human tendencies. But the specific structural identity between the two traditions, the same pattern of impossibly long divine reigns, declining to shorter semi-divine reigns, declining to human-length reigns, the same understanding that a transition event separated the divine age from the human one, is more precise than a general psychological tendency would produce. These traditions are saying the same thing in too much detail for the similarity to be entirely explained by universal human psychology. Something is being remembered, something specific, something with a definite structure, something that two geographically separate civilizations independently transmitted through their royal records as a claim about historical fact. What was it? The Egyptian Tepi tradition also preserves specific claims about what happened during the divine age, what the gods built, what knowledge they established, what the world was like when they were directly present in it. The temples of later Egypt, including the great temple complexes of Karnak, Luxor, Edfu, Dendera, contain texts known as the building texts, inscriptions that describe the construction of the temple as a recreation of a primordial sacred space established in the Tepi. The original temple, these texts say, was built on a mound that emerged from the primordial waters at the beginning of creation. A specific geographic location, a specific sacred site, that was the first place where the divine order was instantiated in physical form. The temples are copies of something older. They are recreations of a divine original that existed in the first time. The physical act of building a temple, the measurements, the alignments, the specific materials, the rituals of foundation, is understood as a replication of what the gods did at the beginning. And the knowledge of how to build the temple correctly, the measurements, the orientations, the astronomical alignments that ensure the temple is a true copy of the divine original, is understood as transmitted from the Tepi, as knowledge that was established in the first time and has been carefully preserved and transmitted ever since. This is, in essential structure, the same tradition we find at Göbekli Tepe, the idea of a sacred knowledge established in a primordial time, transmitted carefully across generations, expressed in monuments that are understood as copies of or references to an original divine prototype. And it is the same tradition we find in the Sumerian king list, the knowledge that the Apkallu brought from before the flood, the wisdom of the antediluvian world, preserved and transmitted across the catastrophe. 3 traditions, 3 civilizations. The same basic claim that there was a time before, that something important was established in that time, and that what we have now is a carefully maintained inheritance from that earlier age. What was the earlier age? What was established in it? And what happened to end it? The Egyptian tradition has an answer to the last question that is worth sitting with. The texts describe a transition from the age of direct divine rule to the age of human pharaohs as involving a specific event, not a flood as in the Sumerian tradition, but something related. A period of chaos, of conflict between divine forces that culminated in the withdrawal of the gods from direct earthly involvement. The myth of Osiris and Set, the murder of Osiris by his brother Set, the dismemberment of his body, the recovery of the pieces by Isis, the posthumous conception of Horus, and the eventual restoration of divine order through Horus's defeat of Set, is understood by Egyptologists as a myth about the transition from the Tepi to the historical period. The death of Osiris represents the end of direct divine rule. The reign of Horus, with which the historical pharaohs identified, represents the human continuation of the divine tradition. Osiris, after his death and dismemberment and resurrection, becomes the god of the dead, the ruler of the underworld, the judge of souls, the divine presence in the realm beneath the earth. He withdraws from the surface world but remains present in the world below it. And Orion, the constellation associated with Osiris, remains in the sky. The divine order of the Tepi is still there, encoded in the stars, available to be read by those who know how to read it. The Great Pyramid, if the Orion correlation is correct, is a permanent record of this reading, a monument that fixes in stone the configuration of the sky at a specific moment in the history of the divine order. The moment of Osiris, the moment of the first time, the moment when the pattern was established that all subsequent Egyptian civilization was trying to perpetuate. Whether that moment is 2500 BCE or 10,500 BCE or some other date, whether the pyramid is as old as the conventional account says or much older, the Egyptian tradition itself says that what the pyramid represents is older than the pyramid, that the Giza monuments are themselves copies of something from the Tepi, expressions of a tradition that predates them. The Egyptians were not claiming to have invented their civilization from scratch. They were claiming to be the inheritors of something much more ancient. And that claim, the claim of deep continuity, of a tradition reaching back before the historical period to the divine age, is what makes the question of the pyramid's age so consequential. If the pyramid was built in 2560 BCE, then the tradition it embodies is at least as old as 2560 BCE. But the Egyptians said the tradition was older, much older, going back to the Tepi, to the divine dynasties, to the first time. Were they right? We cannot say with certainty. The evidence for a pre-dynastic Egyptian civilization of sufficient sophistication to produce the Giza monuments has not been found, not in a form that mainstream archaeology accepts. But the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when the evidence might be in places we have not yet adequately searched. The Nile Delta, where the earliest Egyptian civilization would have been concentrated, given the river's fertility and the accessibility of the Mediterranean, has been subject to thousands of years of flooding, sedimentation, and human construction. Any pre-dynastic remains in the delta would be buried under meters of silt, inaccessible to conventional surface archaeology. The Mediterranean coastline of Egypt, which in the pre-dynastic and early dynastic period extended further into the sea than it does today, the delta has been advancing into the Mediterranean as the Nile deposits sediment, contains the submerged remains of at least one significant ancient city. Thonis Heraklion, discovered by the French archaeologist Frank Goddio in the early 2000s at a depth of 6 to 9 meters below the surface of Abu Qir Bay. Thonis Heraklion is not pre-dynastic. It dates to the first millennium BCE. But its existence demonstrates that significant ancient Egyptian settlements are indeed preserved underwater in the Mediterranean, waiting to be found. What else is down there? What pre-dynastic and early dynastic material lies beneath the sediments of the Nile Delta or the shallow waters of the Egyptian Mediterranean coast? We do not know. The underwater archaeology of the Egyptian coast is in its early stages, technically demanding and underfunded. But the preliminary results, Thonis Heraklion, the city of Canopus near the same location, the traces of other submerged structures, suggest that the archaeology of Egypt has a significant underwater dimension that we have barely begun to explore. And if there is a deeper Egyptian past, if the Tepi tradition is pointing at something real, then the most likely place to find evidence of it is exactly where underwater archaeology is most difficult, in the shallow, sediment-filled coastal waters of the Nile Delta and the adjacent Mediterranean. The Egyptians said they were remembering something. We may not yet have looked in the right places for the evidence that they were right. Let me dwell a little longer with the Tepi concept, because I think it is one of the most philosophically rich ideas in the entire ancient world, and it deserves more than a summary. The Tepi is not just a claim about the past, it is a claim about the structure of time and meaning. In the Egyptian understanding, the primordial moment, the first time, was not simply an event that happened once and then receded into history. It was a moment that remained somehow present, accessible, capable of being re-instantiated through ritual and monument and the correct performance of the divine order. Every sunrise was a reenactment of the first sunrise. Every successful inundation of the Nile was a reenactment of the first rising of the primordial mound from the primordial waters. Every pharaoh was a reenactment of Horus, the divine king. Every temple was a reenactment of the first temple established by the gods in the Tepi. This is a cyclical rather than a linear understanding of time. Not the idea that the past is over and the future is ahead. The idea that the meaningful events of the past, the events of the Tepi, recur, can be accessed, are available to be tapped through the correct ritual and architectural engagement. The Great Pyramid in this framework is not a historical monument. It is not something that was built once and then frozen in the past. It is a perpetual performance of the Tepi, a structure that, by its very existence and its astronomical alignments, continuously re-instantiates the divine order established in the first time. When the descending passage aligns with the pole star, the pyramid is doing something. Not just sitting there as an inert object, but actively participating in the cosmic order that the Egyptians understood the pyramid to embody. This is why the precision matters. The alignment to true north, the encoding of mathematical relationships, the astronomical orientations of the shafts. These are not merely impressive technical achievements. They are the means by which the pyramid performs its cosmic function. The monument that is not precisely aligned does not work. The temple that is imprecisely oriented cannot re-instantiate the Tepi. The precision is theological, not merely aesthetic. And this understanding changes how we should think about the question of the pyramid's date. If the pyramid was built as a perpetual instantiation of the Tepi, of the first time, then its builders were not simply marking their own historical moment. They were encoding a much older moment. The configuration of the stars that the pyramid's shafts point to, the celestial alignment that the Orion correlation references, the astronomical date that the monument encodes. These may not be the date of construction. They may be the date of the Tepi, the date of the first time. And the date of the first time as calculated from the precession of the equinoxes, from the configuration of Orion's belt that the Giza pyramids mirror most precisely, is approximately 10,500 BCE. Whether the pyramids were built at 10,500 BCE, or whether they were built thousands of years later by 4th Dynasty Egyptians who were consciously encoding the date of the Tepi in their monument, is a question the current evidence cannot definitively resolve. But the question is clarified by understanding what the Egyptians believed they were doing. They were not simply building a tomb. They were building a permanent re-instantiation of the divine order established in the first time. And the first time, by their own account, was much older than the 4th dynasty. Let me now bring in the broader pattern that connects Egypt to the other traditions we have been exploring throughout this series. In every video of Arthur's Sleepy History, we have encountered the same basic structure. A civilization that claims deep historical roots, going back to a time before conventional history begins. a catastrophe or transition that ended that earlier age. A tradition of preserving and transmitting the knowledge of the earlier age across the catastrophe. And monuments or texts that encode that transmitted knowledge in forms designed to outlast the people who first possessed it. The Sumerians and their antediluvian kings, the Apkallu, who brought wisdom before the flood, the king list with its encoded precessional numbers, the builders of Göbekli Tepe and their encoded astronomical record, the deliberate burial of the enclosures as an act of preservation, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis and the cosmic catastrophe that may have ended the Ice Age world and reset the trajectory of human civilization. And now, the Egyptians with their Zep Tepi and their Turin king list, and their divine dynasties that preceded the pharaohs by tens of thousands of years. The pattern is too consistent to be entirely coincidental. These traditions are not saying the same thing because they borrowed from each other. The Egyptian tradition developed independently of the Sumerian as far as we can tell, and neither borrowed from the Göbekli Tepe tradition whose very existence was unknown until 1994. They are saying the same thing because they are responding to the same basic situation. They are civilizations that understand themselves to be the inheritors of something older, the transmitters of a tradition whose origins precede them, the maintainers of a knowledge whose source was a world they can no longer directly access. They are saying, something was lost. We are keeping the memory of it alive. And the thing we are making, this pyramid, this temple, this king list, this monument, is our attempt to preserve what we can of what was lost and to send it forward into a future we cannot see. This is, I think, one of the most profound aspects of the ancient world. Not the monuments themselves, impressive as they are, not the astronomical knowledge or the engineering sophistication or the cosmological frameworks, but the impulse behind all of it, the determination to maintain continuity across catastrophe, to be the people who remember, to pass it on. We are the people they passed it to. Whatever was in the Zep Tepi, whatever the ancient Egyptians believed had existed in the first time that no longer existed in their own time, they built the largest monument in the ancient world to preserve the memory of it. And it is still there, in the desert, warm in the dark, waiting. Let me take you back to the landscape. Not the desert that surrounds Giza today, the pale, dry Sahara, the wind-blown sand, the sparse vegetation of a land that receives almost no rainfall. The landscape as it was when the tradition that produced the Great Pyramid was forming. The landscape as it was when the Zep Tepi, if there was a Zep Tepi, was unfolding. The African humid period, which we discussed briefly when we were talking about the Sphinx erosion, lasted from approximately 11,000 years ago to approximately 5,000 years ago. During this period, the Sahara was not a desert. It was a savanna, a landscape of grasslands and lakes and rivers, dotted with trees, supporting populations of large animals, elephants, hippos, crocodiles, giraffes, and the human communities that lived among them. This is documented. It is not speculation. The evidence comes from multiple independent sources. Fossil pollen found in lake sediments across the Saharan region, preserved at depths that correspond to specific time periods. Fossilized animal bones, including hippo and crocodile remains, found in areas that are now hyper-arid desert. Ancient lake beds visible in satellite imagery as dry depressions that preserve the outlines of bodies of water that once existed. And rock art found across the Saharan region in extraordinary abundance, depicting animals that require a wet environment. Swimming hippos, herding cattle, fishing scenes in areas where there is now no water within hundreds of kilometers. The green Sahara was real, and it was recent in geological terms. It ended gradually, but the main phase of desiccation occurred between around 5,000 and 3,000 years ago, precisely the period when the conventional Egyptian civilization was developing. This has profound implications for the question of what was happening in the Nile Valley and its surroundings before and during the development of Egyptian civilization. In the early Holocene, 10,000 to 7,000 years ago, the area that is now Egypt was part of a broader, well-watered landscape. The Nile Valley was wet. The surrounding desert was not desert. The human populations of the region had access to water and food resources that simply do not exist in the same region today. As the African humid period ended, as the Sahara dried gradually but inexorably, the populations that had been distributed across the wider landscape were forced towards the Nile. The river, fed by the Ethiopian highlands and the East African lakes, maintained its water even as the surrounding desert closed in. The Nile Valley became a refuge, a narrow strip of habitable land in an increasingly inhospitable landscape. The concentration of population in the Nile Valley, driven by the desiccation of the Sahara, has been proposed by some researchers as one of the mechanisms behind the rapid development of Egyptian civilization. The people who crowded into the valley brought with them diverse traditions, cultural, technological, cosmological, from the wider Saharan world they had inhabited. The concentration and competition and exchange of these traditions, in the narrow context of the Nile Valley, may have accelerated the development of the complexity that we recognize as pharaonic Egypt. This is the mainstream account of how Egyptian civilization emerged, not from nowhere, not from a sudden leap of brilliance, but from the convergence of Saharan and Nilotic traditions as the desiccation forced the populations of the wider region into the valley. But here is what this account implies, and what is rarely stated explicitly. The traditions that converged in the Nile Valley during the desiccation were not newly developed. They had been developing for thousands of years across the Green Sahara. The cultural and technological sophistication that eventually produced the pharaohs and the pyramids was not invented in the Nile Valley in the few centuries before Nama. It was accumulated across a much wider landscape over a much longer period, and then concentrated and crystallized in the valley as the surrounding world dried. The roots of Egyptian civilization are in the Green Sahara, in the communities that lived for 5,000 years across a landscape that no longer exists. And those communities left evidence. Rock art across the Sahara showing cattle herding and ritual scenes and astronomical symbols, some of which closely resemble the iconography of pharaonic Egypt. Stone circles at sites like Nabta Playa in the Egyptian Sahara, dated to around 6,000 years ago. Astronomical monuments that predate Stonehenge and that show sophisticated knowledge of the solar calendar. Megalithic alignments whose purpose has not been fully determined, but whose sophistication is evident. The roots of Egypt are older and deeper than the conventional account fully acknowledges. The tradition that produced the Great Pyramid did not begin with Djoser's Step Pyramid in 2650 BCE. It began in the Green Sahara, thousands of years before the First Dynasty, in communities whose material remains we are only beginning to identify and study. Whether those roots extend all the way back to a Tepi, to an actual pre-dynastic civilization of sufficient sophistication to build the Sphinx or conceptualize the Giza plateau, is the question we cannot yet answer. But the roots are there. They are real. And they are older than the conventional timeline of Egyptian civilization acknowledges. Now let me spend some time with the alternative researchers, Graham Hancock, Robert Bauval, John Anthony West, Robert Schoch, because I think they deserve more nuanced treatment than they usually receive in either the academic dismissal or the popular celebration. Hancock is the most widely known of these figures. His books, Fingerprints of the Gods, published in 1995, and its successor, Magicians of the Gods, published in 2015, have sold millions of copies worldwide and have introduced the questions we are discussing tonight to an enormous audience that would not otherwise have encountered them. His central argument, developed across these books and in subsequent television and podcast work, is that a sophisticated civilization existed before the Younger Dryas, before the cosmic catastrophe at 12,900 years ago, and that the monuments of the ancient world, including the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx, are the surviving physical legacy of that civilization or of its inheritors who rebuilt after the catastrophe. This argument has two distinct parts. The first part, the existence of a sophisticated pre-Younger Dryas civilization, is speculative but not obviously wrong. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, if correct, did end a world of developing human complexity. The communities that had been on the trajectory towards settlement and intensification were disrupted. Whatever they had been building, materially and culturally, was largely destroyed. The second part, that the specific monuments of Giza are the surviving physical legacy of that pre-Younger Dryas civilization, is much more speculative, and it is here that Hancock's argument runs into its most serious difficulties. The dating of the Giza monuments, as we have discussed, is not settled, but the evidence that exists, the mortar dates, the worker graffiti, the contextual relationship to 4th Dynasty funerary traditions, is broadly consistent with a 4th Dynasty construction and inconsistent with a construction 12,000 years ago. Hancock's response to this is that the original core of the monuments may be pre-dynastic, and that the 4th Dynasty evidence reflects a restoration or completion rather than original construction. This is possible. It is not demonstrable from the current evidence. The mainstream Egyptological response to Hancock has been, for the most part, dismissal. Not always dismissal with detailed argument, sometimes simply dismissal on the grounds that alternative history has a poor track record, and that the conventional account is well supported by the totality of the evidence. This dismissal is understandable but not entirely satisfying. The anomalies we have discussed are real. The water erosion on the Sphinx, the Orion correlation, the acoustic properties of the King's Chamber, the Tepi tradition, the Turin King list. None of these are invented by alternative researchers. They are features of the evidence that the conventional account must explain, and its explanations are not always as robust as the dismissive tone of the response implies. What I would say about Hancock, and about the alternative research tradition more broadly, is this: the questions are better than the answers. The anomalies they have identified are genuine. The conventional account is genuinely incomplete in the ways they point at. The possibility of older roots for Egyptian civilization is genuinely worth exploring. Where the alternative researchers typically go wrong is in the specificity of their claims, not in asking whether Egyptian civilization is older than the conventional account says. That is a legitimate question. But in asserting specific answers. 10,000 years ago, the Tepi was a physical civilization with specific characteristics that go significantly beyond what the evidence can currently support. Science and archaeology advance by asking questions that the evidence can eventually answer. The most productive contribution of the alternative history tradition has been to identify questions that the mainstream has too quickly closed. The least productive has been to assert answers that the evidence does not support, because those assertions discredit the underlying questions and make them harder for serious researchers to pursue. The Sphinx erosion question, which Schoch raised as a geologist using geological methods and geological evidence, is a legitimate scientific question. It deserves serious scientific engagement, and it has received some, though not as much as it deserves. The Orion correlation, which Bauval identified using astronomical calculations that can be independently verified, is a legitimate astronomical question. Whether it is significant or coincidental deserves serious astronomical analysis. These questions are being slowly absorbed into the mainstream, not because the alternative researchers have convinced the mainstream, but because the questions themselves are robust enough that they cannot be indefinitely ignored. What is the mainstream doing with these questions? More than it is sometimes given credit for. The Scan Pyramids project, which used non-invasive technologies to study the interior of the Great Pyramid and discovered the previously unknown void above the Grand Gallery, represents exactly the kind of serious, technologically sophisticated engagement with the pyramid that the alternative researchers have been calling for. Mark Lehner's decades of excavation at Giza, which produced the workers' village and dramatically transformed our understanding of the construction workforce, represents exactly the kind of careful, evidence-based archaeology that the site deserves. The Giza Plateau is one of the most intensively studied archaeological sites in the world. It has been the subject of continuous research for more than 2 centuries, and yet it continues to produce surprises, continues to reveal features and relationships that the existing models did not anticipate. That combination, intense study and continuing surprise, is itself significant. It suggests that the monument is more complex than our current models can fully account for. Not necessarily older, not necessarily connected to a lost civilization, but more complex, more layered, more deliberately designed in ways we have not yet fully understood. The honest account of the Great Pyramid is that we know a great deal about it, and do not yet know the most important things. We know the dimensions, the composition, the orientation, the workforce, the tools, the quarries, the internal chambers and passages. We do not know with certainty what it was for, how some of the most precise stonework was achieved, why the king's chamber has no inscriptions, what is in the newly discovered void, or whether the conventional date of construction represents the full history of the monument's development. That honest account leaves a great deal of room for the questions the alternative researchers have been asking. Not necessarily for their specific answers, but for the questions. And the questions are worth asking. The Great Pyramid is old enough, 4,500 years at minimum, that it has outlasted every civilization that has studied it. The Egyptians who built it are gone. The Greeks and Romans who marveled at it are gone. The Arab scholars who studied it in the medieval period are gone. The European Egyptologists of the 19th century who began the systematic study of it are gone. And the pyramid is still there, patient, precise, aligned to the cardinal directions with an accuracy that was not matched by European architecture until the development of the magnetic compass, and then eventually the GPS. Pointing to stars that its builders considered important enough to spend decades building shafts toward. Whatever it means, whatever its date and its purpose and the full story of its construction, it is a product of minds as capable as ours, of intentions as serious as ours, of a knowledge of the world that we have not yet fully recovered. We are still learning what it contains. We are still learning what it means. And that, the continued openness of the question, is one of the most remarkable things about the most studied monument in the world. Let me spend more time with the Green Sahara, because it is one of the most important and least discussed contexts for the question of Egypt's deep past. The rock art of the Sahara is extraordinary. Tens of thousands of images painted and carved onto rock faces across a region stretching from Mauritania to Libya to Sudan, depicting scenes of a world that no longer exists in those places. Cattle herding, swimming, fishing, rituals involving animals whose presence in the Sahara today would be impossible. Crocodiles, hippos, elephants, giraffes. Some of the Saharan rock art is very old. The oldest sequences based on style and the animals depicted appear to date to the early Holocene, to 10,000 or 11,000 years ago, when the Green Sahara was at its most fertile. The latest sequences extend into the historical period, when the Sahara was already drying and the artists were recording a world in the process of disappearing. What is striking about the Saharan rock art, in the context of our discussion tonight, is the sophistication of what it depicts. Not simply the naturalistic skill of the images, though that skill is often considerable, but the symbolic and cosmological content. Some of the rock art includes scenes that appear to represent ritual activity, figures in ceremonial postures, with elaborate headdresses, in contexts that suggest organized religious practice. Some of it includes astronomical symbols, circles with rays, repeated geometric patterns that may represent the movements of celestial bodies, images that connect the sky to the earth in ways that echo the cosmological frameworks we have been discussing throughout this series. The people who made the Saharan rock art were not simple hunter-gatherers living without symbolic depth. They were people with rich cosmological traditions, with ceremonial practices, with an understanding of the world that found expression in careful, deliberate, repeated imagery on the rock faces of their landscape. And as that landscape dried, as the savanna became steppe, and the steppe became desert, and the lakes shrank and the rivers stopped flowing, these people moved. They moved toward the Nile. They moved toward the margins of the surviving green zone in sub-Saharan Africa. They moved in whatever directions still offered water and food. The ones who moved toward the Nile brought their traditions with them, their cattle herding, their astronomical observations, their cosmological frameworks, their rock art traditions, which eventually found expression in the hieroglyphic imagery of pharaonic Egypt, in the painted walls of tombs and temples, in the iconographic vocabulary of a civilization that modern scholarship still does not fully understand. The bull cult that is so prominent in early Egyptian religion, the sacred Apis bull of Memphis, the Bukis bull of Hermopolis, the Amenevis bull of Heliopolis, is already present in the Green Sahara rock art, where cattle are the dominant subject and appear in contexts suggesting sacred significance. The astronomical orientation of Egyptian temples and monuments, the careful alignment with the rising and setting of specific stars and the solar solstices and equinoxes, echoes the astronomical consciousness evident in the stone circles and alignments of the Saharan Neolithic. Egypt did not appear from nowhere. It crystallized from an older tradition, and that older tradition was distributed across a landscape that no longer exists, preserved in a rock art record that has been studied for decades but has not yet been fully interpreted. What else is in that rock art? What cosmological knowledge, what astronomical observations, what historical memory does it contain that we have not yet read? This is one of the frontiers of research into Egypt's deep past. Not the Giza plateau, which has been intensively studied. The Saharan rock art, which has been photographed and catalogued, but whose content has barely been decoded. And beneath the Saharan rock art, there is more. Buried under the drifting sands of the desert, covered by millennia of wind-deposited sediment, are the remains of the settlements and camps and sacred sites of the Green Sahara people. Artifacts, structures, bones, material culture from communities that flourished for 5,000 years across a landscape that is now one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. Some of this material has been found at Nabta Playa in the Egyptian Western Desert, approximately 100 kilometers west of Abu Simbel, Archaeologists beginning in the 1970s found a site of remarkable complexity. Stone circles, megalithic alignments, elaborate cattle burials, and evidence of a community that was conducting astronomical observations and performing complex rituals in the middle of what is now complete desert. Nabta Playa was a lake, a seasonal lake that filled during the monsoon rains of the Green Sahara period and provided water and grazing for the communities that lived around it. The stone structures at the site appear to have been constructed during the period of the lake's use, beginning perhaps 8,000 years ago. The stone circle at Nabta Playa, sometimes called the African Stonehenge, though this comparison is imperfect, is oriented toward the summer solstice sunrise, providing a calendar marker that would have been practically important for communities dependent on the seasonal patterns of rainfall and vegetation. The megalithic alignments at the site include stones that appear to point toward specific stars as they rose at specific times of year. This is sophisticated astronomical observation and monument building, dated to 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, conducted by communities in the Egyptian Sahara who were the predecessors, cultural if not direct, biological ancestors, of the people who eventually built the pharaonic monuments of the Nile Valley. The roots of Egypt's astronomical tradition are at Nabta Playa. The roots of Egypt's cattle cult are in the Saharan rock art. The roots of Egypt's monumental building tradition are in the megalithic structures of the Green Sahara. All of this is older than the First Dynasty. All of it predates the conventional beginning of Egyptian civilization by thousands of years. And all of it has been studied, partially, imperfectly, with the limitations of the available technology and the available funding, by researchers who are slowly building a picture of a deep Egyptian past that the conventional account has not fully incorporated. The conventional account is not wrong. The Fourth Dynasty built the pyramids. The First Dynasty united Egypt. The pre-dynastic cultures of the Nile Valley are well documented, but the conventional account is incomplete. It does not tell the full story of where those Fourth Dynasty builders came from, what traditions they were inheriting, how old the cosmological framework that gave meaning to their monuments actually was. The Great Pyramid is the product of a tradition that stretches back, at minimum, to the Green Sahara, to the cattle herders and the stone circle builders of Nabta Playa, to the rock artists of the Saharan massifs, to the communities that watched the stars and tracked the seasons across a landscape that was, for 5,000 years, one of the most habitable places on Earth. How much further back that tradition extends, whether it reaches to the Younger Dryas boundary and the catastrophe that ended the Ice Age world, whether it connects to the Apkallu of Sumer and the builders of Göbekli Tepe, whether the Zep Tepi is a real historical memory rather than simply a cosmological concept. These are the questions that the next century of research will begin to address. We are at the beginning of understanding Egypt's deep past, not the end. And that, the genuine openness of the question, the genuine possibility that what we know is not the full picture, is, I think, one of the most exciting things about being alive at this particular moment in the history of archaeology. We may be about to learn something very significant about the depth of human civilization, or we may find that the conventional account is essentially correct, and that the anomalies have conventional explanations that we have not yet fully worked out. Either way, whichever direction the evidence eventually points, the questions are real and worth pursuing. And the monument that prompted all these questions is still standing in the desert, as it has been standing for at least 4,500 years, pointing to the stars it was built to point toward, encoding in its geometry the mathematical relationships its builders considered important enough to build into the most massive structure ever assembled by human hands. Whatever they were trying to say, they said it very loudly. and we are still learning to hear it. Let me go back inside the pyramid. Specifically, let me take you into the descending passage, the original entrance corridor that leads down from the north face of the pyramid into the bedrock beneath it, angled at approximately 26 degrees below the horizontal, heading due north and then descending into the earth. The descending passage is the oldest part of the pyramid's internal structure. It was cut first, before the ascending passages and chambers that represent the revised construction plan, the plan that produced the Grand Gallery and the King's Chamber. The descending passage leads to the subterranean chamber, the unfinished room cut into the bedrock that we discussed earlier, and to a small horizontal passage that leads nowhere in particular. The descending passage is oriented toward the northern sky. An observer standing at the lower end of the passage and looking up its length would, in principle, be looking at a specific region of the northern sky, the region around the celestial North Pole. And the specific point in the northern sky that the passage's angle and orientation aimed at would change over time as the precession of the equinoxes slowly shifted the position of the celestial North Pole against the background of stars. This is the basis of Robert Bauval's astronomical dating argument, the one that produces a date significantly earlier than the conventional Fourth Dynasty dating. When you calculate the date at which the descending passage would have been perfectly aligned with the pole star of the era, the star closest to the celestial North Pole at that time, accounting for the precessional shift of the pole over the centuries, you can theoretically determine when the passage was designed. The angle of the passage encodes, in principle, the intended astronomical alignment, and that alignment corresponds to a specific moment in the precessional cycle. Bauval has calculated that the descending passage was designed to align with the pole star at approximately 2500 BCE, consistent with the conventional date, or at approximately 10,500 BCE, when a different precessional configuration would have produced a similar alignment from a slightly different passage angle. The conventional interpretation is that the passage was designed for 2500 BCE, and that its alignment was with Thuban, the star in Draco that served as the pole star in the Fourth Dynasty period. This interpretation is consistent with the conventional dating and requires no special pleading. The alternative interpretation, that the passage reflects a design concept from 10,500 BCE, later executed at the conventional date, requires the assumption that an astronomical tradition from 12,000 years ago was preserved with sufficient precision to influence the specific angle of a construction project 8,000 years later. This is not impossible. The Egyptian tradition explicitly claims exactly this kind of transmission of knowledge from the Zep Tepi. But it requires accepting that the Egyptian tradition's own account of its origins is historically accurate in ways that mainstream Egyptology does not generally accept. What I find interesting about both interpretations is that they share an assumption that the passage angle was deliberately calculated to produce a specific astronomical alignment. The disagreement is about which alignment and when. Both interpretations treat the passage as intentionally astronomical rather than accidentally so. And if the descending passage is intentionally astronomical, if the builders chose its angle to create a specific sight line toward a specific star, then the pyramid's astronomical dimension is not limited to the shafts of the king's chamber and the general orientation to true north. It extends to the fundamental structure of the oldest passage in the monument. The entire pyramid is an astronomical instrument. This is a significant claim, but it is a claim that emerges from the evidence, from the measured angle of the passage, from the known positions of the stars at the relevant periods, from the documented astronomical orientation of the monument as a whole. It is not invented by alternative researchers. It is a consequence of taking the measurements seriously. What the measurements mean, what the pyramid was designed to do astronomically, and why and for whom, is where the interpretations diverge. Let me spend some time with the mathematical relationships in the pyramid's dimensions, because I introduced them briefly in part 1, and I want to explore them more fully. The relationship between the pyramid's height and its base perimeter, height times 2 pi equals perimeter, is the most discussed mathematical encoding in the monument. But it is not the only one. The secant, the ancient Egyptian unit of slope, measuring the horizontal distance per cubit of vertical rise, of the Great Pyramid's faces is approximately 5.5 secant. This specific slope produces, automatically, the golden ratio phi in the relationship between the slant height and the base. The Egyptians may or may not have been consciously encoding phi. They may simply have chosen a secant value that they preferred for practical or aesthetic reasons, and the phi relationship may be a consequence of that choice rather than the goal. But here is what makes this interesting. The phi relationship and the pi relationship are mathematically related. You cannot have one without something very close to the other, given the specific geometry of the pyramid. The choice of secant that produces phi also produces the approximation of pi. If the Egyptians deliberately chose the secant to produce phi, or pi, they automatically got both. Whether they knew this, whether the builders of the Great Pyramid understood the mathematical relationship between pi and phi, and deliberately chose a secant value to exploit it, is a question that cannot be answered from the surviving evidence. Egyptian mathematics, as we know it from the Rind mathematical papyrus and other sources, does not use pi or phi as named constants. But the Egyptians' practical mathematics was sophisticated, and the ability to work with proportional relationships without formalizing them as mathematical constants is well within the capacity of any skilled ancient mathematician. The more significant question for our purposes tonight is not whether the Egyptians encoded pi and phi intentionally. It is what the encoding tells us about the level of mathematical knowledge that the pyramid's design assumes. The relationship between the pyramid's height and the Earth's polar radius, the height times 43,200 equals the polar radius, requires knowing the Earth's size with remarkable precision. The ancient Egyptians' surveying technology was highly developed. They were capable of very accurate land measurement across large distances, as the layout of the Giza plateau itself demonstrates. But measuring the Earth's radius requires either very sophisticated astronomical observation or a tradition of knowledge that predates the direct measurement. How did the builders of the Great Pyramid know the Earth's size well enough to encode it in the monument's dimensions? The mainstream response is that the relationship is coincidental, that the correspondence between the pyramid's dimensions and the Earth's size, while striking, is within the range of chance correspondences that can be found in any complex structure with many measurable dimensions. This is a legitimate methodological point. If you measure enough things and look hard enough for numerical relationships, you will find some. But the coincidence response becomes less satisfying as the number of independent correspondences accumulates. Pi, phi, the Earth's polar radius, the precessional number 43,200, the alignment to true north, the stellar alignments of the shafts. Each one individually might be coincidental, but the convergence of all of them, each one pointing to a sophisticated mathematical and astronomical knowledge, is harder to explain as chance. The alternative is that the builders possessed knowledge we have not attributed to them. Knowledge of the Earth's size, of precessional cycles, of the relationships between pi and phi, that either they developed independently or inherited from an earlier tradition. The Egyptian tradition itself says they inherited it from the Tepi. from the divine dynasties that preceded the pharaohs, from the knowledge transmitted across the transition from the divine age to the human age. Whether that is history or mythology, whether the tradition of inherited knowledge reflects a genuine historical transmission or a theological framework for understanding wisdom as divinely given, is precisely the question we are sitting with. Let me turn to the other pyramids of the Fourth Dynasty, because the context of the Great Pyramid within the broader pyramid building tradition is important for evaluating the alternative hypotheses. The pyramids of Sneferu, Khufu's father, represent the learning curve that led to the Great Pyramid. Sneferu built at least 3 pyramids, possibly 4, at the sites of Sayla, Meidum, Dahshur, and perhaps elsewhere. The most important of these, for our purposes, are the Bent Pyramid and the Red Pyramid at Dahshur. The Bent Pyramid is named for its distinctive change of angle partway up. The lower courses rise at approximately 55 degrees, while the upper courses are at approximately 43 degrees. This change of angle, most researchers believe, reflects a structural problem encountered during construction. The lower angle was too steep for the structure's stability, and the builders adjusted mid-construction to avoid catastrophic failure. The Red Pyramid, completed after the Bent Pyramid, maintains the shallower angle throughout and is the first true smooth-sided pyramid. It is smaller than the Great Pyramid, but similar in its basic design, and its internal chambers are the direct predecessors of the Great Pyramid's chambers. This developmental sequence, the Step Pyramid of Giza, the collapsed Pyramid of Meidum, the Bent Pyramid with its structural correction, the Red Pyramid as the first successful smooth-sided pyramid, and finally, the Great Pyramid as the culmination, is one of the strongest arguments for the conventional dating. It is a coherent technological progression, with each monument representing the lessons learned from the previous one. If the Great Pyramid was built thousands of years before Khufu, if it predates the developmental sequence that apparently led to it, then the developmental sequence is a coincidence, not a progression. The Fourth Dynasty would have built progressively more sophisticated monuments leading up to the Great Pyramid, while the Great Pyramid itself was already standing, already much more sophisticated than anything in the sequence. This is an awkward scenario for the alternative hypothesis. The developmental sequence is real and coherent, and genuinely points toward the conclusion that the Great Pyramid was built at the end of that sequence, not before it. The alternative hypothesis needs to account for this. The most common response is that the Fourth Dynasty built what they built in the context of an even earlier monument that set the standard. That the Great Pyramid was already there, already representing a level of sophistication that the Fourth Dynasty builders were aspiring to, but not quite achieving. In this reading, the developmental sequence of Sneferu's pyramids is not a progression toward the Great Pyramid, but an attempt by later builders to replicate or approach the standard set by the Great Pyramid. This is possible. It is not demonstrable, and it requires the Great Pyramid to have been built by an unknown, unnamed, archaeologically invisible civilization that left no other clear material traces at Giza. The weight of the developmental sequence evidence, the coherent technological progression from Giza to Khufu, is, I think, the strongest single argument for the conventional dating. It does not rule out the possibility of an older monument beneath or within the structure we see, but it does make the alternative hypothesis significantly harder to sustain. What the alternative researchers need, what would decisively shift the debate in their favor, is direct physical evidence of an earlier construction phase. Not the water erosion of the Sphinx, which is ambiguous. Not the Orion correlation, which is contested. Not the mathematical relationships in the pyramid's dimensions, which the mainstream can attribute to coincidence, or conventional Egyptian knowledge, but something unambiguous, a datable stratum of construction beneath the current structure, a chamber or passage that predates the 4th dynasty by the radiocarbon dating of its mortar or its organic inclusions. That evidence has not been found. It may not exist, or it may exist in the parts of the pyramid and the plateau that have not yet been fully investigated, in the body of the pyramid beneath the currently accessible chambers, in the unexplored void above the Grand Gallery, in the bedrock beneath the Sphinx. The Scan Pyramids project has demonstrated that the Great Pyramid contains voids we did not know about. The investigation of those voids, when technology and political will permit, may produce evidence that resolves some of the questions we have been sitting with tonight. Or it may produce new questions that we have not yet thought to ask. This is where we are with the Great Pyramid, surrounded by questions, holding the evidence carefully, resisting the temptation to close the question before the evidence is sufficient to close it. That resistance, that determination to sit with genuine uncertainty rather than reach for premature certainty in either direction, is, I think, the most intellectually honest and ultimately the most productive stance. The pyramid is patient. It can wait for better methods. We are the ones who need to learn to wait. While we wait, let me tell you about some things that are happening right now, in the present tense, in the ongoing research, that are directly relevant to the questions we have been sitting with. The Scan Pyramids project, which announced the discovery of the large void above the Grand Gallery in 2017, has continued its work. The project uses several non-invasive technologies to probe the interior of the pyramid without drilling or excavating. Muon tomography, the use of cosmic ray particles which penetrate stone with a known probability to image the interior of large structures, has been the primary tool for the void discovery. Infrared thermography, the imaging of temperature differences on the surface of the pyramid, which can reveal voids or different materials beneath the surface, has also been used, and ground-penetrating radar has been applied to the plateau around the pyramid to look for subsurface features. The void above the Grand Gallery is the most dramatic result so far, but the imaging has also revealed other anomalies. Areas where the muon flux is slightly different from what a uniform stone structure would produce, that have not yet been fully investigated. Some of these anomalies may be construction features, spaces left between courses of stone for structural reasons, or rooms that were filled during construction and are thus no longer accessible. Some may be undiscovered chambers. The process of investigation is slow. The Egyptian authorities, understandably, are cautious about authorizing any invasive investigation of the monuments. A drilling error, a poorly planned excavation, damage to irreplaceable ancient materials. These are real risks that must be weighed against the potential gains of a more aggressive investigation. The Scan Pyramids team has been careful and collaborative, working within the Egyptian framework rather than against it. But the investigation will continue, the technology will improve, and eventually, perhaps in this generation, perhaps in the next, the interior of the Great Pyramid will be more fully mapped, and the questions about what it contains will begin to have answers. What might those answers reveal? Several possibilities. The most dramatic would be the discovery of a chamber that was sealed during original construction and has never been opened. A chamber that contains objects, inscriptions, or materials that could provide direct evidence of the monument's date, purpose, and builders. The discovery of a royal burial, for instance, would settle the tomb hypothesis decisively. The discovery of inscribed tablets or papyri, if they survived, which would depend entirely on the conditions within the chamber, could provide direct textual evidence. A less dramatic but still significant discovery would be the dating of materials in a previously inaccessible part of the monument. If radiocarbon dating of organic material from deep within the pyramid, in a part of the structure that has not been accessible since construction, produced dates significantly older than the conventional 4th Dynasty date, that would shift the conversation substantially. And the discovery of structural features that don't fit the conventional construction model, passages or chambers with orientations or dimensions that the conventional interpretation cannot explain, would open new questions even if it didn't immediately answer the old ones. The investigation of the Great Pyramid is not complete. It is ongoing, and the results of that ongoing investigation will eventually change what we know, in ways we cannot predict from our current position. Let me also spend some time with what the plateau around the pyramid contains, because the pyramid does not exist in isolation. The Giza Plateau is a complex of monuments, not just the 3 famous pyramids, but also the Sphinx Temple, the Valley Temple, multiple smaller subsidiary pyramids, the remains of a workers' village, causeways, boat pits, and the fragmentary remains of other structures that have not been fully excavated. 2 boat pits adjacent to the Great Pyramid contained full-sized wooden boats, dismantled and buried, presumably for the pharaoh's use in the afterlife. One of these boats was excavated in the 1950s and is now displayed in a purpose-built museum at the Giza site. It is 43 meters long, one of the oldest intact wooden boats ever found, and it is extraordinarily well preserved. The second boat pit was investigated non-invasively in the 1980s and early 2000s, and then excavated in 2010. The boat within was found to be in a poorer state of preservation than the first. The boat pits are relevant to the question of the pyramid's date, because the boats themselves can be dated by radiocarbon analysis of their wood. The radiocarbon dates obtained from the first boat are consistent with the 4th Dynasty, placing the boat's construction at approximately the time of the pyramid's conventional date. This is one of the cleaner pieces of dating evidence for the Giza complex. But the boat pits also raise a question. The boats were intended for the pharaoh's use in the afterlife. They are funerary boats, buried beside the pyramid as part of the funerary complex. If the pyramid was primarily something other than a tomb, if the alternative researchers are right that its function was not funerary, then why are funerary boats buried beside it? One answer is that the funerary boats and the pyramid serve different functions simultaneously. That the pyramid was a cosmological monument and an astronomical instrument and a ritual space, and that it was also associated with the pharaoh's afterlife in ways that the funerary boats represent. These are not mutually exclusive categories. The complex symbolism of Egyptian royal funerary practice was exactly that. Complex, and a monument could serve multiple functions simultaneously. Another answer is that the funerary boats were added to the pyramid complex by Khufu or his successors as a funerary addition to a monument whose original function was different. That the boat pits represent the 4th Dynasty pharaoh's appropriation of an existing sacred space for his own funerary purposes. This is the kind of interpretation that the alternative researchers favor, but it requires a level of historical complexity that the conventional account does not need. The honest answer is that the relationship between the pyramid and the funerary boats is consistent with the conventional account and does not require the alternative interpretation. But it is also consistent with a more complex history in which the pyramid's function evolved or was appropriated over time. The Sphinx Temple and the Valley Temple, the massive limestone block structures we discussed in Part 2, have their own complex history. The Valley Temple has been more thoroughly studied than the Sphinx Temple, and its analysis has produced evidence that is difficult to fit neatly into either the conventional or the alternative account. The Valley Temple is constructed in 2 phases that are clearly visible in its fabric. The lower phase consists of the enormous limestone blocks, up to 200 tons, that we discussed. The upper phase consists of smaller, more manageable blocks of Aswan granite, which were added to the limestone core at a later date. The granite phase is stylistically consistent with the 4th dynasty. The casing of the temple in granite, the specific decorative program, the inscriptions, and is most plausibly attributed to Khafra, who is conventionally credited with building the temple. The limestone core, the massive water-eroded blocks, is another matter. If Schoch's water erosion argument is correct, and the limestone core of the Valley Temple was cut from the Sphinx enclosure, then the limestone core of the Valley Temple is as old as the Sphinx. And the Sphinx, if Schoch is right, is much older than the 4th dynasty. The Valley Temple would then be a monument with a limestone core that is perhaps 7,000 to 10,000 years old, encased in 4th dynasty granite. Khafra would have found the limestone core already standing, along with the Sphinx it came from, and would have added the granite casing and the decorative program, making the temple his own. This interpretation is consistent with all the physical evidence. The different construction phases are real. The water erosion on the limestone is real. The 4th dynasty character of the granite work is real. The only question is whether the limestone core predates the granite, and if so, by how much. The conventional Egyptological response is that the limestone core and the granite casing were built as part of a single 4th dynasty construction project. That the difference in construction material reflects functional and aesthetic choices rather than different construction periods. This is possible. It is not obviously wrong, but it leaves unexplained the water erosion on the limestone blocks, which the conventional account attributes to mechanisms that Schoch and others have argued are insufficient. The debate about the Valley Temple limestone core is directly connected to the debate about the Sphinx erosion, and it has the same unresolved character. I have been talking for a long time about the physical evidence for the pyramid's age and the debates around it. Let me now take a step back and ask a different question. Why does this question matter? Why should the age of the Great Pyramid be something that anyone who is not an Egyptologist cares about? The obvious answer is that the Great Pyramid is the most famous monument in the world, and the mystery of its construction and purpose is intrinsically interesting. That is true, and it is sufficient reason. But there is a deeper reason. The question of the Great Pyramid's age is, at its core, a question about the depth of human civilization. About how long human beings have been doing the things that define civilization, building large structures, developing sophisticated mathematics and astronomy, creating complex cosmological frameworks, organizing large-scale social projects. The conventional account says approximately 5,000 years. The development of writing, the first cities, the first monumental architecture. All of these emerged at roughly the same time in the period around 3000 BCE in the Fertile Crescent and the Nile Valley. The alternative account says longer, perhaps significantly longer. Perhaps the capacities that produced the Great Pyramid were present in some form long before the conventional beginning of civilization. Perhaps the civilization that produced the pyramid had roots that extend back into the Younger Dryas period or before. If the conventional account is right, then the emergence of civilization 5,000 years ago was a relatively rapid transition from a long prehistory of hunter-gatherer and early agricultural life. Human beings had been anatomically and cognitively modern for 100,000 years before they built anything comparable to the Great Pyramid. If the alternative account is right, if the roots of Egyptian civilization extend back 10 or 12,000 years, if there was a sophisticated culture in the Nile Valley or the broader African Near Eastern region long before the conventional beginning, then the emergence of civilization is a more complex and ancient process than we have recognized. And the 100,000-year gap between the emergence of modern humans and the emergence of civilization requires a different explanation. This matters, not because it changes how we live our daily lives. The age of the Great Pyramid has no practical consequences for anything most of us will do tomorrow, but because it changes the story we tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from. If civilization is 5,000 years old, we are a young species, capable of remarkable things, but recently capable with the vast majority of our history as a species spent in a pre-civilizational state. If civilization is 10,000 or 12,000 years old, we are older than we thought. Our capacity for the kinds of achievements that the Great Pyramid represents has been present for longer. The story of human development is deeper and more complex. And the catastrophe that ended whatever preceded the conventional beginning of civilization, the Younger Dryas, the cosmic impact, the great flood that appears in the myths of every ancient culture, was not the end of a primitive world. It was the end of something more developed, more sophisticated, more capable than we have been willing to acknowledge. That is why the age of the Great Pyramid matters. That is why we are sitting with the question tonight. Let me try to do something that is harder than it sounds. Let me try to give you an honest accounting of where we stand, not the triumphant certainty of the alternative researchers who have sometimes claimed more than the evidence supports, and in doing so have made the underlying questions harder for serious scholars to engage with. Not the confident dismissal of the orthodox position, which has sometimes waved away genuine anomalies with more assurance than the evidence warrants. Just, here is what we know. Here is what we don't know. Here is where the evidence is genuinely strong and where it is genuinely weak. And here is what I think, with all appropriate uncertainty, sitting with this question in the quiet. What we know with reasonable confidence. The Great Pyramid was built during or very near the 4th dynasty of ancient Egypt, approximately 4,500 years ago. The mortar dates, the worker graffiti, the developmental sequence from Djoser through Sneferu to Khufu, the consistent attribution in ancient Egyptian sources, all of this points to the 4th dynasty. The probability that the conventional date is completely wrong, that the pyramid was built thousands of years earlier by an unknown civilization, is low. Not zero, but low. The pyramid was built by an organized, paid, managed workforce of approximately 20 to 30,000 people, working in rotating shifts over approximately 20 years. This is not speculation. It is the result of careful excavation of the workers' village and detailed analysis of the logistical requirements of the construction. The pyramid contains 3 main chambers, 4 shafts, and a previously unknown large void above the Grand Gallery. The shafts are oriented towards specific stars, as they appeared at approximately 2,500 BCE. The chambers show no evidence of funerary use, no mummy, no inscriptions, no funerary goods in the king's chamber. The pyramid's dimensions encode mathematical relationships, pi, phi, a correspondence to the Earth's polar radius, that are either intentional or coincidental. The precision of this encoding is consistent with sophisticated mathematical knowledge, either possessed by the 4th dynasty Egyptians or inherited from an earlier tradition. The alignment of the pyramid to true north is accurate to approximately 3.6 arc minutes, a precision achievable through careful astronomical observation of the circumpolar stars. The Sphinx shows erosion features that some geologists interpret as water erosion from a wetter climate, which would require a construction date earlier than the conventional 4th dynasty dating. Other geologists and Egyptologists dispute this interpretation. The debate is unresolved. The Orion correlation, the correspondence between the 3 Giza pyramids and the 3 belt stars of Orion, is real. The correspondence is best at approximately 10,500 BCE if the precessional argument is correct. The significance of this correspondence is disputed. The ancient Egyptians themselves claimed a history extending back to the Tepi, the first time, which they described as an age of direct divine rule, preceding the historical dynasties by tens of thousands of years. The Turin king list records divine and semi-divine dynasties with reigns lasting tens of thousands of years before the historical pharaohs. The roots of Egyptian civilization extend into the Green Sahara, to the cattle herders and monument builders of the African humid period, who contributed their traditions and knowledge to the Nile Valley communities as the Sahara dried. The Nabta Playa stone circle, dated to approximately 6,000 years ago, shows sophisticated astronomical knowledge in a pre-dynastic Saharan context. What we do not know with certainty what the Great Pyramid was for. The tomb hypothesis is the mainstream answer, but is not fully consistent with the evidence from the king's chamber. We do not know how the most precise stonework, the casing stone joints of 0.02 millimeters precision, the granite work of the king's chamber, was achieved with the tools conventionally attributed to the 4th dynasty. We do not know what is in the large void above the Grand Gallery, or what is beyond the stone slabs at the ends of the Queen's chamber shafts. We do not know whether the Sphinx is older than the conventional dating, or whether Schoch's water erosion interpretation is correct. We do not know whether the Tepi refers to an actual historical period of sophisticated human activity that preceded the conventional beginning of Egyptian civilization, or whether it is a theological concept, the eternal divine past, rather than a claim about historical fact. We do not know whether the mathematical relationships in the pyramid's dimensions are intentional encodings of specific knowledge or coincidental correspondences. And we do not know whether the civilizational tradition that produced the Great Pyramid extends back through the Green Sahara and the Younger Dryas to a world we have not yet found, a world that may be preserved in fragments in the underwater archaeology of the Mediterranean coast and the Nile Delta, or in the unexplored rock shelters and buried sites of the Sahara, or in the traditions of the Egyptian priests who told the Greeks that their history was vastly longer than anything the Greeks had access to. The honest accounting produces a picture that is neither as settled as the conventional account suggests, nor as overturned as the alternative account claims. The pyramid is genuinely mysterious. Not in a supernatural sense, not in a sense that requires alien builders or advanced technology of a kind we cannot identify, but mysterious in the sense that the most studied monument in the world still contains questions that the most careful scholarship has not resolved. And that mystery, that genuine evidence-based scholarly uncertainty, is worth sitting with in its own right, not as a failure of knowledge, as a feature of the landscape, as one of the places where human understanding has genuinely not yet reached the full complexity of what humans once built. Let me spend some time now with the specific experience of being in Egypt and being near the pyramid, because I think the physical reality of the monument says something that the scholarly debate cannot fully convey. People who have stood at the base of the Great Pyramid, not in a photograph, not in a documentary, but physically present with the stone in front of them, consistently report something that is difficult to articulate. Not a supernatural experience, not a mystical one, something more fundamental, the visceral reality of a thing so large that scale loses its normal meaning. We experience scale through comparison. A tree is tall relative to a person. A building is large relative to a tree. A mountain is immense relative to a building. Our sense of what is large and what is not is calibrated by experience, by the accumulated reference points of a lifetime of living in a human-scaled world. The Great Pyramid defies this calibration. It is so much larger than anything in ordinary human experience that the mind cannot process it as a single object. It becomes instead a landscape, a terrain that you move through rather than a thing that you look at. And when you look at individual stones, when you put your hand on a limestone block and feel its texture and its size, and then look up at the courses of similar blocks rising above you, the arithmetic becomes not abstract but physical. 2.5 million blocks, each one this size, stacked in this arrangement, and this going on in every direction for the full height of the monument. The weight of that, not the metaphorical weight, but the actual physical weight, the 2.5 million tons of stone pressing down on the bedrock of the Giza plateau, is something the body registers differently from the mind. The mind can hold the number. The body, standing at the base, feels something the number does not convey. What did the people who built this feel, working on it? What did the workers who dragged the blocks up the ramps experience when they looked down from the growing height and saw the plateau spreading out below them and the Nile glinting in the distance? What did the architects feel when they checked the alignment and found it accurate to the arc minute and understood that what they were building was working as they had designed it? We cannot know. The experience of the builders is gone with the builders. What remains is the stone. But the stone is sufficient. The stone is, in its own way, the experience. 12,000 years or 4,500 years. The duration does not change what the stone is. It is here, it is real. It is the product of minds that were as capable as ours, working toward goals that mattered to them enough to organize 20,000 people across 20 years. Whatever those goals were, I want to spend some time with the broader context of the pyramid within the history of monument building, because the Great Pyramid does not exist in isolation. It is the largest and most famous expression of a human impulse that we have been tracing throughout this series. At Göbekli Tepe, 12,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers organized themselves to build T-shaped pillars and carve them with the images of the animals of their cosmological world. The impulse was cosmological, the need to embody in stone the understanding of the world that the community held most sacred. At the Giza Plateau, 4,500 years ago, or perhaps much longer, an organized state directed the labor of tens of thousands of workers toward the construction of 3 pyramids that mirror the belt stars of Orion, that are aligned to true north with extraordinary precision, that encode in their dimensions the mathematical relationships of the universe. The impulse is the same. The scale is enormously larger. The social organization required is incomparably more complex. But the underlying human drive, the need to say something important in a material that will outlast the people who build it, to fix in stone a relationship between the human world and the cosmic order, is continuous. From the carved limestone pillars of Göbekli Tepe to the pyramids of Giza, a line can be drawn. Not a direct line. There are thousands of years and hundreds of cultures and countless transformations between them, but a line nonetheless. A thread. The thread that we have been following throughout this series. The thread of the tradition that tried to remember, to preserve, to transmit across the catastrophe of the Younger Dryas, the knowledge that was most important to preserve. Whether the Great Pyramid is part of that tradition, whether it is a direct expression of the knowledge that survived the Younger Dryas, transmitted through the Green Sahara cultures and the Natufian tradition and the pre-pottery Neolithic monuments of the Fertile Crescent, is not demonstrable from the current evidence. But the structural similarity is real. The impulse is real. The result a monument of extraordinary precision and scale, oriented to the stars, encoding mathematical relationships, built to last, is real, and we are still standing at its base, still holding our hand against the warm stone, still asking what it means. Let me do something I rarely do in these videos. Let me tell you what I think, not what the evidence proves. We have been careful about that throughout tonight, not what the alternative researchers claim or what the mainstream dismisses. What I actually think, sitting with all of this, in the quiet. I think the Great Pyramid was built during the 4th dynasty of ancient Egypt. The evidence for this is substantial and coherent, and the alternative, an earlier, unknown civilization, requires assuming the existence of something that has left no other clear material trace. I think the pyramid was not primarily a tomb. The evidence from the king's chamber, the absence of inscriptions, the absence of a mummy, the unsealed sarcophagus, is too anomalous for the conventional funerary explanation to be fully satisfying. The pyramid was doing something else, or something more than providing a resting place for a pharaoh's body. I think the 4th dynasty Egyptians possessed a level of mathematical and astronomical knowledge that the conventional account has underestimated. The precision of the monument, the alignment, the mathematical relationships, the stellar orientations, implies capabilities that go beyond what the surviving texts of Old Kingdom Egypt directly attest. Whether those capabilities were developed independently by the 4th dynasty or inherited from an earlier tradition, I do not know. I think the roots of Egyptian civilization extend significantly deeper than the conventional account acknowledges. Back into the Green Sahara, back into the cultures of the African humid period, back to traditions that are only partially visible in the archaeological record. The Tepi may be a genuine historical memory, attenuated, mythologized, overlaid with theological interpretation of a deeper civilizational past. And I think the questions the alternative researchers have identified, the Sphinx erosion, the Orion correlation, the mathematical relationships, the acoustic properties, are real questions deserving serious engagement, even if the specific answers the alternative researchers propose go beyond what the evidence currently supports. These are my honest opinions. I hold them loosely. I am not a professional Egyptologist or archaeologist, and the people who have spent their careers studying these monuments have access to evidence and expertise that I do not. I may be wrong. I am likely wrong about some of this. But in the small hours of the night, holding the question as carefully as I can, this is where I land. The pyramid is older than its conventional date in the sense that matters most. Not 4,500 years old, but the product of a tradition that is at least 10,000 years old, and perhaps much older. Whether the specific structure we see at Giza was built during the 4th dynasty or earlier, it expresses a knowledge and an impulse that goes back much further than any individual construction date. It is the expression of the long human project of trying to understand the world, of trying to say what is most important in a form that will endure, of building something that will outlast the builders and speak to whoever finds it. It speaks to us. Every night that someone lies awake wondering about the Great Pyramid, the monument is doing what its builders intended. It is saying, pay attention. There is something here. Look at the stars. Consider the mathematics. Hold the question. We are holding it. Let me spend more time with the experience of the monument at night, because I think there is something in the specific quality of the darkness at Giza that is relevant to everything we have been discussing. The Giza Plateau, in the hours before dawn, is one of the oldest inhabited landscapes on Earth. Human beings have been sleeping and waking and looking at these stones for at least 4,500 years. And, if the alternative researchers are right, for much longer than that. The stones have been here through all of it. Through the New Kingdom and the Late Period and the Greek and Roman occupations and the Arab conquest and the Ottoman Empire and the colonial period and the independence of modern Egypt, through all the wars and floods and famines and plagues and political transformations that have swept over this region since the monument was built. The pyramid does not care about any of this. It does not care about Khufu or Khafra or Alexander the Great or Napoleon Bonaparte or the tourists who photograph it every morning. It is simply there, pressing its weight against the bedrock of the plateau, pointing to the stars it was built to point toward, maintaining year after year, millennium after millennium, the alignment to true north that its builders worked so hard to achieve. There is something almost unbearable about that continuity, the persistence of a thing across all the change that has happened around it. Every civilization that has encountered the pyramid has had to grapple with it. The later ancient Egyptians visited it as a sacred site and left graffiti on the casing stones, grateful visitors paying their respects to the work of their ancestors. The Greeks and Romans visited it and were astounded. The Arab scholars of the medieval period developed elaborate theories about what it contained and what it was for. The European explorers of the Renaissance and the early modern period competed to be the first to penetrate its interior chambers. The British and French imperialists of the 19th century stripped it of its casing stones and carried off its secrets to museums in London and Paris. And yet, the pyramid endures. Diminished, the casing is gone, the capstone is gone, the smooth white surface that made it appear as a continuous mountain of stone is gone, but structurally intact. The chambers are still there, the alignment is still there, the mathematical relationships are still there. Whatever the pyramid is trying to say, it is still saying it. I want to spend some time with the specific question of consciousness, not in a mystical sense, but in a practical one. What does it mean to stand in the king's chamber and experience the space? The king's chamber, as we have discussed, has specific acoustic properties, but it also has specific visual properties. The granite walls are a deep, mottled pink, not uniformly coloured, but varied, with crystals that catch light differently depending on the angle. In torchlight or lamplight, which is how the space would have been illuminated when it was in use, the walls would have appeared to move, the crystals shifting from dark to bright as the flame moved, the shadows changing, the surface appearing almost liquid. The room is sealed. There are no windows, no openings to the outside except for the narrow shafts that point to specific stars. In the interior of the king's chamber, with the entrance sealed and only a lamp burning, you are in a space that is defined entirely by its stone. The outside world does not exist. The noise of the wind, the sounds of the city, the light of the sun, none of these penetrate. There is only the granite and the flame, and the sound of your own breathing echoing slightly in the resonant space. What was done in this room? What rituals, what ceremonies, what initiations or astronomical observations or royal performances took place in this space that was so carefully designed and so precisely built? We do not know. The answer is not preserved in the texts. The later Egyptian religious texts, the pyramid texts, the coffin texts, the Book of the Dead, describe the afterlife journey in elaborate detail, but they do not describe rituals conducted in specific pyramid chambers. The practices that took place in the king's chamber, if any did, are not documented. What we can say is that the space was designed to be inhabited, not abandoned after construction, not simply a sealed void. The king's chamber is a room. It has a floor you can stand on, walls you can touch, a ceiling that creates a specific enclosed volume. It was made to be in. Whatever was done in it, someone was here. And sitting with that, with the specificity of that human presence in this space, 4,500 years ago or more, is one of the most moving things about the pyramid for me personally. Not the engineering or the mathematics or the astronomical alignments, impressive as all of those are, but the presence, the fact that someone stood here in this room, in this granite, and whatever they believed about the world, they believed it strongly enough to build this around themselves. They built the room first, then they built the pyramid around it. 2.5 million blocks of stone, arranged with extraordinary precision, surrounding a room that is roughly 5.5 meters wide, 10 meters long and 5.5 meters tall. The room is the point. The pyramid is the vessel. Whatever was in the room, whatever ceremony or knowledge or ritual or observation the builders considered important enough to protect with the largest stone structure ever built, was the reason for all of it. And we have not found it. Not the mummy, not the texts, not the objects. If there was ever anything in the king's chamber beyond the granite sarcophagus, it was removed at some point, before recorded history caught up with the monument. Or it was never there, and the room's function was not storage, but performance. Or, and this is the possibility that the alternative researchers have sometimes gestured toward without stating clearly. What was in the king's chamber was not an object, but a condition, an acoustic state, an astronomical alignment, a specific configuration of the space that could only be achieved in the room as it was designed, that required the room to be exactly these dimensions and exactly this material. And that was the purpose toward which everything was built. The room as instrument, the pyramid as the instrument's housing, and the knowledge of how to play the instrument, of what to do in the king's chamber to achieve the intended effect, was the knowledge that the tradition was preserving and transmitting. The architectural knowledge was not the secret. The king's chamber was not hidden. What was hidden was the use. This is entirely speculative. I want to be clear about that. There is no direct evidence for this interpretation. It is a possibility space, not a proven claim. But it is a possibility that the physical evidence, the acoustic properties, the stellar alignments of the shafts, the absence of funerary goods, the presence of the apparently functional resonant space, is consistent with. And that consistency, the fact that the evidence is consistent with the pyramid being designed as a ritual instrument rather than a tomb, is worth acknowledging even if it cannot be proven. The pyramid is not well explained as a tomb. It may be well explained as something else. What that something else is, we are still working out. Let me come back now to the question of knowledge and transmission, because it connects everything we have been discussing in this video back to the broader themes of this series. The ancient Egyptians said their knowledge came from the Zep Tepi. The Sumerians said their knowledge came from the Apkallu, the beings from before the flood. The builders of Göbekli Tepe, if the warning hypothesis is correct, were trying to transmit their knowledge to whoever came after the catastrophe. All of these traditions are about the same thing: knowledge that predates the catastrophe, knowledge that needed to be preserved, knowledge that was encoded in monuments, in texts, in the structural relationships of stone and star, because knowledge held only in human memory is vulnerable to exactly the kind of disruption that the catastrophe produced. The Great Pyramid in this reading is not just a monument to the pharaoh Khufu or to the Egyptian civilization of his time. It is a library, a repository of knowledge encoded in three-dimensional space, in the proportions of the chambers, the angles of the passages, the orientation of the shafts, the mathematical relationships of the dimensions. The knowledge it contains, if it contains knowledge in this sense, is not literary. It is not text that can be read. It is architectural. It can only be understood by someone who knows how to read architecture as a language of mathematical and astronomical relationships, Who knows what the dimensions are trying to say? Who understands why the shafts point where they point? Did the ancient Egyptians know how to read it? The evidence from the building texts and the pyramid texts and the Tepi tradition suggests that they did, or at least that they believe they did, that they understood themselves to be the inheritors of a specific body of knowledge transmitted from the first time. Do we know how to read it? Not fully. We can measure the dimensions and calculate the mathematical relationships and trace the stellar alignments. But whether we are reading the text correctly, whether we are understanding what the builders intended to encode, is a question we cannot answer with confidence. The monument says something. We are still learning the language, and that learning, the ongoing, multi-generational, collaborative human project of trying to understand the most studied monument in the world, is itself a form of paying attention, of honoring the intelligence and the intention that produced the monument. The builders of the Great Pyramid built for exactly this kind of attention. They built something that would demand careful study for as long as it stood. Something that would reward sustained inquiry with deeper and deeper levels of apparent meaning. Something that would resist easy explanation and require the most serious intellectual engagement. They succeeded. The pyramid has been demanding serious intellectual engagement for more than 4,000 years. It is demanding it right now. And whatever the answer to the question of its age and purpose turns out to be, the fact that we are still asking the question, still bringing our best tools and our most careful thinking to bear on a structure that was built before writing, is itself a form of tribute to what was built. We are worthy receivers of the transmission, even if we have not yet fully decoded what was transmitted. I want to spend our final stretch of tonight with something that is not about the pyramid specifically. It is about what the pyramid makes us feel, about the specific quality of attention that very old things demand, and about what it means to be the kind of creature that built the Great Pyramid, or that tried to understand it across the full span of the human story. There is a particular emotion that I do not think has a good name in English. Some languages come closer. The Japanese word mono no aware. The bittersweet awareness of impermanence, the feeling that beautiful things are beautiful partly because they will not last, gets at something. The Portuguese word saudade, a longing for something absent, a nostalgia for something that may never have been, gets at something else. What I mean is the feeling you get when you stand at the base of the Great Pyramid and try to hold in your mind the full weight of what you are looking at. The feeling that something very significant happened here, something that produced this, and that whatever that something was, it is no longer fully accessible. That the knowledge, the intention, the specific understanding of the world that made this necessary, all of that is gone. What remains is the stone, and the stone is beautiful. The stone is magnificent. The stone is one of the most extraordinary material productions in the history of the species. But the stone is not the thing. The stone is the vessel. The thing itself, the knowledge, the intention, the cosmological understanding that made the vessel necessary, is what we cannot fully recover. That loss, combined with the recognition of what was lost, that is the emotion I am reaching for. The awareness of absence in the presence of the most studied monument in the world. It is, I think, the same emotion that the ancient Egyptians were trying to address with the concept of the Tepi, the first time, the divine age before the historical period, is not present, but its effects are. The patterns established in the first time are still operative. The mathematical relationships, the astronomical alignments, the sacred geometries, all of these are expressions of a knowledge that was established before the human period and that the pyramid, is trying to keep alive. The pyramid says, the Tepi happened. Something was established there that matters. We have tried to encode it in stone so that it will persist even when the people who understood it are gone. And the pyramid was right to try. Whatever the Tepi was, whether it was a historical period, a theological concept, or a mythologized memory of the green Sahara cultures and the pre-Younger Dryas world, the attempt to preserve it in stone has succeeded. The stone is still here. The mathematical relationships are still here. The astronomical alignments are still here. Whatever was most important about the Tepi tradition, the pyramid has preserved it across 4,500 years of human history. Whether it has preserved it in a form we can still read is the question. Let me talk about the specific stars that the shafts of the king's chamber were pointing to, because I want to make the astronomical dimension of the pyramid feel more concrete. The southern shaft of the king's chamber, the shaft that exits through the south face of the pyramid, points at an angle of approximately 45 degrees above the horizontal. When you trace this angle outward and calculate where it would have pointed at the time of the pyramid's construction, in approximately 2500 BCE, it aligns with the culmination, the highest point in the sky, of the star Alnitak. Alnitak is the lowest of the three belt stars of Orion. It is the star that Bauval identifies as the one mirrored by the Great Pyramid itself in the Orion correlation. The southern shaft of the king's chamber points toward the star that corresponds to the pyramid in the terrestrial celestial map. There is a self-referentiality to this that I find remarkable. The pyramid points to the star that it represents. The monument, in some sense, knows what it is. It knows its place in the cosmic map that the Giza plateau embodies. The northern shaft of the king's chamber points at approximately 32 degrees above the horizontal. At the time of construction, this angle aligned with Thuban, the star in the constellation Draco that served as the pole star of the era, the star closest to the celestial North Pole in 2500 BCE. A shaft pointing to the pole star from the burial chamber of the pharaoh. The pharaoh's soul, in Egyptian belief, was destined to join the circumpolar stars, the stars that never set, that move around the pole in eternal circles without ever descending below the horizon. These stars, never setting, represent eternal life. The northern shaft points the pharaoh's soul towards the eternal. The southern shaft of the queen's chamber points at approximately 39 degrees. At approximately 2500 BCE, this angle aligns with the star Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, associated in Egyptian religion with the goddess Isis and connected to the annual Nile flood. The heliacal rising of Sirius, its first appearance above the horizon in the pre-dawn sky after a period of invisibility, marked the beginning of the Egyptian New Year and heralded the annual inundation of the Nile. The northern shaft of the Queen's chamber points at approximately 39 degrees in the opposite direction. At approximately 2500 BCE, this angle aligns with Kochab, a star in the constellation Ursa Minor, not a pole star, but a bright circumpolar star that was well placed in the northern sky at the time of construction. 4 shafts, 4 stars, Orion's Alnitak, Thuban the pole star, Sirius of Isis, Kochab of the northern sky. Orion is Osiris, the god of the dead, the divine king, the constellation of resurrection. Sirius is Isis, the goddess of wisdom and magic, Osiris's wife and the one who restored him after his murder. Thuban is the eternal, the pole star, the fixed point around which everything rotates, the symbol of the soul's destination. And Kochab is the circumpolar guardian, always visible, never setting, a reference point of permanent presence in the northern sky. The pyramid is built around the cosmological map of the afterlife. The shafts are the roads the soul travels. The chamber is the departure point. And the 4 stars are the destinations and the guides. This is theology expressed in architecture. Not abstract theology, not propositions about the nature of the divine written in a text, but embodied theology. Theology you can stand inside. Theology that uses the actual stars as its vocabulary, that encodes the relationship between the earthly and the divine in the angle of a shaft through 2.5 million tons of stone. Whatever its date, whatever its full purpose, whatever the knowledge that lies behind its design, the pyramid is an extraordinary act of communication. Not communication between pharaoh and subjects or between king and gods in the abstract. Communication between the builder's understanding of the universe and the physical structure of the world. An attempt to make the invisible visible, to make the cosmic tangible, to fix in stone the relationships that the builders considered most fundamental. That attempt, regardless of its specific date or its full success or failure, is one of the most magnificent things the human species has ever done. And it is still doing it. Every morning the sun rises over the Giza plateau, and the shadow of the Great Pyramid falls across the desert, and the pyramid is still there, still aligned, still pointing to the stars it was built to point toward. 4,500 years of mornings. And still. Let me think about what it means to inherit this. We, the people alive today, reading and watching and listening to the accumulated scholarship and speculation about the Great Pyramid, did not build it. We did not choose to receive the tradition it represents. We were born into a world in which the pyramid already existed, already studied, already the subject of a multi-century argument about what it means and how old it is. But we are the inheritors of it nonetheless. Every generation inherits the monuments of the previous generations. Not just the physical monuments, but the intellectual monuments, the accumulated understanding of what those physical monuments mean and how they fit into the larger story of human achievement. And the intellectual monument of the Great Pyramid, the 4,000-year tradition of wondering about it, is itself one of the most extraordinary things in human culture. The ancient Egyptians wondered about it, the Greeks who visited it wondered about it. The Arab scholars of the medieval period wondered about it. The European explorers of the early modern period wondered about it. The Egyptologists of the 19th and 20th centuries wondered about it. And the researchers of the present day, mainstream and alternative alike, are still wondering about it. That continuity of wondering, the fact that the same questions have been asked in different languages, in different cultural frameworks by different methods for 4,000 years, is itself a kind of monument, a monument to human curiosity, to the capacity of the human mind to sustain a question across centuries, to keep asking even when the answer is elusive, to return again and again to the same stone and ask it what it means. You are part of that tradition tonight, not because you have studied Egyptology or because you have been to Giza or because you have read the relevant technical literature. Simply because you are lying in the dark at whatever hour this is for you, wondering about the Great Pyramid. That wondering, that simple, persistent, human act of wondering about very old things, is the thread that connects you to every person who has ever done the same. To the tourists of the Roman Empire who came to Giza and scratched their names on the casing stones. To the Arab caliphs who spent fortunes trying to discover the pyramid's secrets. To the French savants who accompanied Napoleon's Egyptian expedition in 1798 and produced the Description de l'Égypte, the first systematic modern study of Egypt's monuments. To the Egyptologists of the last 2 centuries who have measured and mapped and argued and slowly built the picture we have today. All of them were doing what you are doing. holding the question, turning it over, trying to hear what the stone is saying. What is the stone saying? I think, and this is my own sense of it, held loosely, the stone is saying something like this. We were here. We understood things. We built this so that something of what we understood would survive us. We could not know who would find it or when, but we trusted that someone would. We trusted that the capacity for this kind of attention, for this kind of sustained, serious, reverent wondering about the world and our place in it, would persist in the species, whatever else was lost. We trusted the future with something important, and the future received it. You received it. Whatever the pyramid means, whatever the full story of its construction and purpose turns out to be, the transmission was successful. The vessel crossed the gap. The message arrived. We are reading it still. There is a specific quality of the desert night in Egypt, in the region around Giza, that I want to invoke before we begin to let the night go. The desert at night is cold, not the cold of northern winters, not the damp cold that chills the bones, the dry cold of a place that has no water to hold the day's heat, where the temperature drops sharply after sunset and the air becomes clear and still, in a way that air with moisture in it never quite achieves. In that dry, clear, cold air, the stars are extraordinary. The Milky Way is not a suggestion but a fact, a visible structural feature of the sky, a river of light dense enough to cast a faint shadow. The planets are bright enough to read by if you hold a page at the right angle. The horizon is sharp and flat, the desert stretching away in every direction without the interruption of hills or trees, giving the sky its full extent from due east to due west. And somewhere in that sky, depending on the season, depending on the hour, Orion is there. The hunter, the constellation of Osiris, the divine king who died and was dismembered and was restored and became the Lord of the Eternal. 3 belt stars in a slightly curved line, 2 brighter stars above for the shoulders, 2 below for the feet, the red supergiant Betelgeuse marking the right shoulder, the blue-white Rigel marking the left foot, the same Orion that the pyramid was built to mirror, the same configuration that has been in the sky since long before the pyramid was built, that will be in the sky long after everything human has returned to dust. The stars do not change on human timescales. They were the same stars that the 4th Dynasty workers saw when they looked up from their ramps and their sledges and their calculations. They were the same stars that whoever came before the 4th Dynasty saw, if anyone did. They are the same stars that Khufu saw. If Khufu was a real person who stood here and looked up, in the years his workers were raising the monument that would eventually bear his name. And they are the same stars that are overhead right now, wherever you are above whatever ceiling separates you from the night sky. The sky connects us to the pyramid in the most literal sense. The light from those stars is real, physical light, photons that have been traveling for hundreds of years or thousands of years, or in the case of the more distant stars, millions of years, and that are arriving at the Earth right now. Some of those photons are hitting the granite of the king's chamber. Some are hitting the limestone of the plateau. Some are hitting the closed eyes of someone lying awake in the dark, in their particular place, at their particular hour. You are receiving the same light that the builders received. That is not metaphor. That is physics. The light from Alnitak, the star that the king's chamber southern shaft was pointing toward, is arriving at Earth right now, and some of it is falling on the same latitude where the pyramid stands, and some of it is falling on you. The pyramid was built partly to mark this relationship, to make permanent, in stone, the acknowledgement that the sky and the Earth are in relationship, that the lights overhead are not random or indifferent, but a part of a pattern that includes us, that we are part of the cosmos, not just philosophically, but physically, connected to the stars by the light they emit and we receive. The builders of the pyramid understood this. Whatever else they understood or did not understand, they understood this. And they built it into their monument with a care and a precision that 4,500 years of weather and human interference has not diminished. We are still in relationship with the same stars. The night is very deep now. The questions are very large, and the pyramid is very old. Let us begin to let it rest. The pyramid does not need your understanding to endure. It has been enduring without anyone's understanding for 4,500 years. It will continue to endure long after tonight's wondering has resolved into sleep and then waking, and then the ordinary pressures of a day that has nothing to do with ancient Egypt. But the wondering, the specific act of attention you have brought to this tonight, has done something. It has maintained a thread, a small contribution to the multi-thousand-year tradition of paying serious attention to the most serious monument in the world. It has added one more night of wondering to the accumulated archive of human wondering about the Great Pyramid. That is not nothing. In the context of what the pyramid is asking of us, sustained, careful, reverent attention, every night of honest wondering is a contribution. Let your body settle now. Feel the surface beneath you, the ordinary weight of yourself, carried by whatever surface is holding you. A mattress, a floor, a reclining seat, whatever specific physical reality is between you and the earth tonight. The earth beneath you has been carrying human beings for a very long time. In the Nile Valley for tens of thousands of years. In the region around Giza specifically, for at least as long as the pyramid has stood. All those generations of people lying down at the end of the day, letting the earth carry them for the hours of unconsciousness. The pyramid was there for all of them, watching, in a sense, not with consciousness or intention, but with the simple persistence of a very large thing that has not moved. The same thing in the same place through all of it. Let the king's chamber be quiet. Let the granite walls hold their coolness and their slight resonance, waiting for whatever sound might activate them, which tonight, in the stillness, is none. Let the shafts point to their stars without anyone watching. Alnitak in the south, Thuban in the north. The relationship maintained whether observed or not. Let the Sphinx sit on its haunches in the dark of the Giza plateau, facing east toward a sunrise that is still hours away. The missing nose, the weathered face, the enormous body carved from the living rock of the plateau, sitting as it has been sitting, through all the centuries and all the changes and all the questions about how old it really is. The Sphinx is patient. It has been sitting for at least 4,500 years. A little longer tonight is nothing to it. Let the green Sahara be what it was, green and warm and full of the sounds of cattle and birds, and the people who lived across it for 5,000 years, before the desert closed in, and they moved to the river and began, slowly, to build what would eventually become the world's oldest surviving civilization. Let the Tepi be what it was. A first time, a golden age, a moment when the pattern was established that all subsequent Egyptian civilization was trying to perpetuate. Whether it was history or theology, it mattered to the people who built the pyramid. It gave them a framework for understanding what they were doing and why. Let the stars continue their slow processional drift, the celestial North Pole tracing its 26,000-year circle through the sky, the constellations gradually shifting their positions relative to the solstice points, the great clock of the heavens ticking at a pace that makes human history seem instantaneous. All of this is still happening. The procession continues, the stars drift, the pyramid stands, and you are here at the end of a long night of wondering somewhere in the world at your particular hour in your particular life. You are part of the long tradition of people who have wondered about the Great Pyramid, and you are part of the even longer tradition of people who have wondered about their place in the universe, who have looked up at the stars and felt the question without being able to articulate it, who have built things larger than themselves in the attempt to say something that ordinary life cannot contain. That tradition is what you are, not the individual person lying in the dark. The tradition, the long human impulse to pay attention to the things that matter most, to build something that will outlast you, to send something forward into a future you cannot see. The builders of the Great Pyramid trusted the future with something important. You received it. That is enough. That is, in its quiet way, extraordinary. Let your breathing slow. There is nothing you need to understand right now. The pyramid will still be in the desert when you wake up. The Sphinx will still be sitting. The stars will have moved a few degrees in their nightly arc, but Orion will still be there, or setting, or not yet risen, depending on the season and the hour, ready to be found again. The questions will be exactly where you left them, patient, waiting, and I will still be here in the quiet, wondering about very old things. Sleep well.